Welcome back to the Outlet Podcast. I'm joined today with my brother Paul.
How's it going?
And along with Eric as well.
Yeah.
What's up, Eric?
All right. So I guess we'll get right into it. So I want to talk today not necessarily about the coronavirus itself, but the economic implications of the coronavirus, right? Because what we're seeing right now in American society is full-fledged panic, right? Every industry, every institution is panicking. Our leaders don't know what to do. They're confused and they're panicking. And anyone that says they know exactly what to do is
Trying to sell you something.
or pulling the wool over your eyes, you know? And what this panic has done is it's hit a couple of industries especially hard, right? And we're going to talk about the oil industry now, right?
Yes.
And that's because something unprecedented has happened, right? Negative oil futures here in America. That has literally never happened before in history ever, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so in order to explain how we got to this place, we need to go back about 6 months, right? And so in the global oil market, 3 countries control pretty much the entire supply of oil, and when they adjust their oil supply, it impacts the price of oil in the whole world, right? And that's Saudi Arabia, Russia, and America now, right? And about 4 months ago, Saudi Arabia and Russia started engaging in an oil price war, right? They had complaints over the other, each of their, outputs of oil, right? And they struck back the only way they knew how, which was flooding the oil market with tons and tons of cheap oil to outsell the other country, right? And that drove oil prices down a lot, right? And as a result, U.S. fracking companies were not able to sell their oil profitably because in order to frack in the U.S., it costs around $40 a barrel, right? As opposed to in Saudi Arabia and Russia, it costs around $20 a barrel, right? So they were able to sell for, $20, $30 a barrel, and that meant that U.S. fracking companies were losing money by selling oil, right? Mm-hmm. So at that point, the U.S. oil industry was already unstable. They were losing money, and the banks that they had been funded by were looking at these loans and reevaluating them, right? So this massive fracking push that has happened in America over the past decade, it was not funded with the oil companies' own money, right? It was funded by American banks that put out massive loans because they expected oil to, remain at around $60 a barrel, and they would be able to make a nice little profit.
They expected demand to continue to be up.
Exactly. What they didn't expect was a virus to take down the entire global economy and tanked the global demand for oil, right? And so, 2-3 months ago, oil was already at an extremely low price, right? Because of the price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia, right? U.S. fracking companies were hurting, right? And then coronavirus hit, right? Which meant that the global demand for oil plummeted, right? Industries are no longer operating. People aren't driving their cars. At every single level, less oil is demanded, right? Which drove the price down even more, right? Because now all of a sudden these companies aren't able to sell their oil at all, right? And at this point, all of the oil storage facilities have been filling up, right? Because these U.S. fracking companies aren't able to sell their oil, right? So they stick it in a tub in Texas, right? And they stick it all over the country, right? But as this coronavirus has hit, and in early April, those tubs have filled up completely, right? And you might ask, well, isn't the next logical step just to stop pulling oil out of the ground, right? You've got all these storage containers full of oil, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you just stop for a minute and just chill out, all right? But the thing is that these fracking companies, because they're funded by bank loans, are constantly at risk of getting their loans revoked and their assets seized by these banks, right?
Right.
So essentially what they want to do is that by continuing their oil production, they are hoping that oil prices will go back up in the near future, because if they shut down production right now, it will cost a lot more to get it started back up again, right? Once you fire all the workers, once you send all the managers home, once you stop the trucks from coming in and out, it costs a lot more money to get that process started up again.
Sure.
And time and money, right? As opposed to just keeping everything going and losing money throughout that process, right?
And also there's 2 million workers who work in the oil industry. And if you halted all the pumps, then 2 million workers would just get unemployed instantly.
That's right. And if those banks saw that, right, that, listen, all of these oil ventures that we've invested in are no longer profitable, they've gone under, they've fired all their workers, it's much easier for those banks to simply seize those assets and get those companies to default on their loans, and all of a sudden the entire American fracking industry is out of business, right? So in order to stay alive, right, these fracking companies are selling oil or basically giving away oil futures for free, right?
Yeah.
They're saying we'll pay you $40 a barrel to take this oil, right? Because we want to keep this oil flowing so we stay solvent in the near term, right?
Right.
And it's something that's really unprecedented. This has never happened in history ever, right?
Yeah.
It's just really strange.
It's very strange, right?
It's really hard to get your head wrapped around negative oil futures.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
A future is basically the rights to 1,000 barrels of oil. Right. So you're buying the rights of 1,000 barrels of oil at a certain price, so that you can sell the future later at a different price, hopefully more than what you bought it at. Right. So if you buy one future that's 1,000 barrels of oil, it went down to negative $40 per barrel. That means you instantly get $4,000, $40,000, right? If you buy one oil future. Problem is, where the hell are you going to store 1,000 barrels of oil?
All of the storage facilities are already full.
Yeah.
And it's not only that, but not only do you have to pay to store it, but you have to pay to ship it, because this oil isn't just going to show up at your door. It's like in Oklahoma or something, or Texas.
Yeah.
So
it's not like us regular Joes can just, check off, I'm going to buy a bunch of oil and just drive a truck out there.
The problem is a lot of people's futures were expiring completely worthless because it's written in the contract, if you buy a future of oil, that you have to take 1,000 barrels of oil at the price that you agreed upon in your futures contract, or you can sell your future. But the problem is, no one is going to buy a future contract to store 1,000 barrels of oil when they don't have that capability. So no one's going to buy your futures contract. So there's no speculation going on in the market. So all these futures are just expiring completely worthless.
Yeah, definitely.
People are just pumping money into it like, oh, heck yeah, negative future prices. That's never happened before. It's like,
get $40,000 instantly.
Yeah, exactly.
You get $40,000 instantly, but then you can't actually exercise in your contract because they can never ship you the 1,000 barrels of oil.
Well, and
you
also,
can't get them.
I'm sure there's tons of regulation on actually taking 1,000 barrels of oil.
Yeah.
Like,
oh yeah, you can't put it in your back pool.
Yeah,
for sure. For sure. You can't just empty out the pool and that's 1,000 gallons.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really unprecedented time. And what has it done to the overall economy?
Well, basically, what I think we're going to see is that this is going to sort of deal a second blow to the American economy, right? Because we've already seen the recession, depression, whatever you want to call it, as a result of the coronavirus, right? Over 10 million people filed up for unemployment, right? Stocks have plummeted, right? But within the next 3-4 months, you're going to see all of these oil companies default on their loans, right? And all of those banks are going to be forced to take massive losses, billion-dollar losses, right? And we've seen what happens when a massive part of the American economy defaults on a bunch of loans, and the banks are, bear the brunt of that loans, right? That's what happened in 2008 with the mortgage crisis, right? So if the entire American oil industry goes under and takes down several banks with it, right, we're going to see a second, blow dealt to the American economy, and as a result, the Federal Reserve is just going to continue to spend trillions of dollars to try to prop these industries up and bail them out, resulting in even more inflation and, a further deterioration of, middle class people's savings, right? And just continue to, destabilize the system by, pumping money into a system that doesn't have any more wealth total, right?
Yeah.
So
when unemployment goes up, the stimulus packages also go up. That seems to be the trend. And they're working on like a $500 billion deal currently.
Yeah, I mean, they've been putting billions of dollars into the economy every single day.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, the solution seems very clearly to be, at least the solution to the economic problem is to just reopen everything. Get industry pumping again. Get that sweet oil juices flowing in your machinery and in your cars, so that these prices actually go back up, because the demand is incredibly low right now because nobody's working.
Well, I think it's a little bit more complex, because most of the oil consumption, correct me if I'm wrong, comes from airliners, right?
Not most. I mean, like, it's a pretty good chunk of it.
A very
right?
good chunk of it.
Cars also a pretty good chunk of it. You know, all the plastic that we use is made with oil. All the fertilizer that we use is made
Yeah, I was
with
about to say it's a lot. I think the majority of it is
it's
industry.
pretty spread out, right?
It's pretty spread out.
Also,
Like manufacturing.
just straight energy, right? We have a lot of electric plants that are just run on oil,
Right. Yeah. Right.
I mean, yeah, it's very spread out, but the coronavirus has resulted in a downturn in all industries and economic, right?
Right.
Economic downturn in all industries, right?
Yeah.
Everything is going down, and everything demands less oil at this point. So yeah, I mean, oil prices are not going to go up anytime in the near future.
Definitely,
right?
because the demand is not there.
The demand is not there, right?
And we keep oversupplying too.
Definitely.
So, I mean, you can't expect to. I think one way that you increase the price of oil is by shortening the supply, right? Because if you shorten the supply, the demand may raise. But I'm still a little bit confused about what actually happened with Saudi Arabia, Russia, and the United States with the OPEC deal, and how that actually affected oil prices. Because it sounded like it was going to increase the price of oil, because they were trying to work out a deal where the price of oil was all connected between the three countries, right?
Yeah, and they reached that deal, right? But that was right at the time where coronavirus struck America, right? So, if we had been in regular times, right? If it was the before times, we would be fine, right? And the price of oil would remain at a stable level, right? But because the global demand just dropped so suddenly, then that deal essentially fell through, right? They had a deal that limited each country's supply of oil, but as a result of the coronavirus, that deal essentially fell through, right?
Right.
But I really want to look at is reviving the fracking industry really beneficial for America, right? Because, I mean, obviously, yes, jobs are good, right? And having 2 million jobs is a good thing, right? But if we look at fracking itself, it's one of the most destructive things that we can do to our country, right? Because essentially there's a bunch of oil in cracks in rocks in the ground, right? So it's not these oil reservoirs the way there is in Saudi Arabia and Russia, where you just put a pipe into it and it just comes shooting out. Instead, it's a tiny bit of oil spread throughout these cracks in the rocks over a massive amount of land, right? And then what they do is they shoot water down into those cracks, right? And then the oil just comes seeping up through the ground over this massive area of land, basically destroying all of that land ecologically, right? Because all the soil is full of oil. All the plants get full of oil. All the animals that eat those plants die because they're eating crude oil, right? And it's no longer farmable. It's no longer fertile, right? And it just destroys that amount of land permanently for a quick buck, right? And we've seen this happen in Pennsylvania. We've seen it happen in Colorado. We've seen it happen in both the Dakotas, right? Massive amounts of land destroyed because oil companies want to make short-term gains at the cost of the long-term health of our country, right? So to me, letting the fracking industry die, sure, it would be a short-term hit, right? But it would be a long-term benefit, right? And I think that instead of pumping money into this dying industry, right, that operates at the cost of Americans' health, right, and our ecological health, instead we take that money and we can pump it into renewable energy, right? Pump it into solar startups, pump it into wind farms, pump it into geothermal, right? Which are all, much more viable sources of energy than oil, right? Which is a short-term gain, right? The wind is always going to blow, the sun is always going to shine, right? Why don't we invest in those long-term sources of energy that don't hurt the American people's health and the, America's ecological health, right?
Yeah, well, how would you implement that, right? Because the oil companies in America have an extraordinary grip over what they can, what they cannot do, right? Political regulations, right? So the way that I see it is they're not going to stop anytime soon because they already have their hand in government in so many different places. So for the government just to bring down the hammer and say, there's no more fracking, you can't do that anymore. I just don't see that as actually going to happen. Because, they're paying their politicians and making sure that they can continue what they're doing.
Definitely. I mean, I'm not necessarily advocating for a forceful government shutdown of all fracking in the country, right?
Yeah.
Although that would be the optimal scenario, right? But instead, we can just let the free market play its part, right? We let the free market reach its own conclusions, right? And we can do that by not subsidizing oil prices, right?
Right.
And the thing is, at base value, oil is cheaper to produce in Saudi Arabia and Russia, right? It's cheaper to let them pump it out of the ground and ship it over to America than it is to get it out of Nebraska, right? Because fracking is a more expensive process than having oil wells, right? So if we let the free market play its hand, right, we stop subsidizing oil, we stop artificially pushing that price down, and we let the free market play its part, the cheaper oil coming from Saudi Arabia will dominate U.S. fracked oil, right?
Yeah, well, that would mean we would have a dependency on outside sources for oil, though, right? And if you could find a way to replace our dependency for oil on some renewable energy source, then by all means. But I don't think it's viable currently because pretty much all our systems in America run on oil.
Right.
Well, oil is just a lot cheaper to run your company on, to run your machines on, and some machines require oil, but it's a lot more difficult to take a factory which has already been doing it a certain way for a long time and then switch it over. That's definitely not possible in now's climate. It's hardly possible when you're making tons of money.
Yeah,
Definitely.
Well, before we get into it, right? Let's set some precedents, right? Oil is not dependable, right? We're not going to be able to run everything on oil forever, right? Now, if the human race is going to be able to outlast the supply of oil in the world, who knows, right? This might be the last year for us, right? We don't really know, right? But we're not going to be able to pull oil out of the ground forever, right? It's going to run out, and as it's running out, it's going to get more expensive, right? So that is a barrier that we are going to run into at some point as a race, right? That's something that we are going to have to deal with at some point, right?
Definitely.
And if we want to prepare for that point, I think that the best way to prepare our industries to wean off of oil is using the most basic economic tool, which is if you want people to stop depending on a good, you raise the price of that good, and they're going to look for alternatives, right? So by slowly cutting back oil subsidies, industries will start to look for other alternatives, right? And they're going to get rid of the the least efficient uses of oil first, right? If oil is just barely cheaper than a natural gas alternative or a renewable energy alternative, then that's going to be the one that switches over first, right? Because now all of a sudden oil is a little bit more expensive and it's actually cheaper to use solar for that, right? And then it's going to get as oil prices slowly increase, they're going to move their way up the supply chain, and the less efficient uses of, or the more efficient uses of oil are going to get replaced by renewable energy sources, right? So that's one way that we can do it without government regulation, without technology forcing, without saying, hey, listen, you have to do this thing, right? You have to switch out this machine for this machine. We can allow the free market to play its role, to play its hand, right? And businesses will naturally shift away from using fossil fuels to using renewable energy.
Isn't that what Europe did?
I mean, in a way, yes, but Europe is still very
dependent,
very
on
oil dependent, right?
Yeah.
But I think that is what we are going to see in the future, hopefully, if our leaders, pull their, heads out of the sand, right? But I don't really see any alternative that, allows our planet to live.
Alternative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We're not going to, if we keep on pumping oil until all the oil wells are dry and burning that oil until there's no oil left, right? It might be cheaper, right? But at the end of the day, it comes at the cost of our planet and our health and, the survival of Earth, period, right? Which I think that is a more important thing than the profits of a few oil companies and lobbyists in Washington.
Yeah, it seems like it's more economical in the long term to have renewable energy sources anyways. Like, if that's what the market decides that it wants, because oil is a very short-term play. I have oil. Once it runs out, I buy more oil. And there is going to be more oil, hopefully. But when you have renewable energy, it's like, I'll buy this. I mean, we did that with our house, right? Because we have solar panels now. Yeah. It's like, well, we can keep paying our energy bill that's really expensive, or we can get solar panels and in 10 years have them paid off, and then after that,
you have to make a short-term high investment.
That's right. That's right. You have
so
to make
that's it's a problem, because if you don't have the capital to make a short-term investment like that, then you're not going to reap the benefits of it later. I mean, that's why people, for the longest time, I'm not talking about in any time, any current time, but a long time ago, people had to switch over from heating their homes with oil to other things. And there are still homes that heat with oil in northern America and Canada and different places. They get really freaking cold. They have to heat their house with oil because it's more efficient. Some people just didn't switch over because it was still cheap. Then eventually it switched over with regulations and et cetera, to where people are like, that's a thing of the past now.
Yeah.
So another thing to consider is that, like Eric was saying, when the demand is there, people are going to meet that demand. When there's $1 to be made in mowing someone's lawn because they have grass, someone is going to buy a lawnmower and mow your grass. If there's a demand, there's going to be someone to meet it.
Yeah.
So there's a demand for oil. Well, there's not nearly as much of a demand right now for oil. So what's going to happen to these oil companies that are continuing to produce oil? Like Eric was saying, they're going to keep getting propped up. They're going to keep getting propped up. So they're not going to collapse. The banks are not going to collapse because JPOW is just going to keep pumping his money printer, and it's going to pump money into the economy.
Yeah. But
So they're not going to collapse right now. But what you're saying is we should just let them naturally die out.
right, and all that money that we're pumping, like you said, in order to switch over to renewable energy, requires a large upfront capital investment.
So you're saying instead of putting $2 trillion in the oil industry, we should put $2 trillion in renewable energy
right?
industry.
Give loans to small businesses to give them the capital opportunity to invest in renewable energy, right?
Yeah.
And this is what my dad does for a living, right? He invests finds renewable energy projects, and he coordinates, capital, labor, and the resources necessary to get those projects done, right? And the reason so many businesses are choosing to operate their own renewable energy on site is because it allows them to not be at the whim of global oil prices.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely.
Because when you have thrown $1 million at a solar plant right outside of the factory, you know what the price is going to be, right? You're going to be paying back that loan, right? And you know exactly what the price of energy is going to be. And it doesn't matter if there's a war in the Middle East or if Russia and Saudi Arabia are engaging in a price war. You know exactly what energy prices are going to be.
You don't have to
because
worry about your political
it's right,
allegiances.
Yeah, exactly.
Shifting.
It's right in the backyard, right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And to
So
me,
it's just more sustainable.
it's
right?
sustainable. It's more decentralized. To me, it seems like the future, right? And the longer we push it off, and the longer we stay in bed with oil companies, it's worse for our people, it's worse for the planet, and it's worse for the economy.
Boom.
Very nice
Period.
bow.
Yeah,
on the
yeah,
discussion on the top of that.
exactly.
Tie the bow.
Yeah, but I really do
the
think
wax
these
seal
oil
on the letter.
companies. I really do think these oil companies are at risk of really going under at this point because it's the only way that I see them sustaining, their business as a whole is by receiving government aid, right? And if the government just decides, I don't want to give you $1 trillion,
But why would they do that? Why would they decide not to do that?
I don't know, man. I don't know. I've been really wrong in my predictions recently. So
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. I mean,
Who expected oil prices to go up this week?
yeah, exactly.
Nobody.
No one.
yeah.
Oil prices went up.
Yeah.
In stock market.
Stock
Yeah.
market.
But negative
The
oil
trading
prices.
Negative oil
Still
prices.
blows me away.
Right.
It is really strange. Negative futures doesn't really make sense. It's like, here I have 100 pigs.
Yeah.
You
yeah.
can buy a future to purchase 100 pigs at this price, and in the future, hopefully the price of pigs will go up, and then
Yeah.
you'll make some money.
Yeah.
It's I'll
Here,
give
it's
you
it's
money
like I'll
and
give you money and I'll
pigs.
give you pigs.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You got a backyard, you got some feed here. Here's some money for the feed, and here's the pigs.
Yeah, it's
That's never
ridiculous.
happened.
Yeah. Where you just go into 7-Eleven, you put a Gatorade on the counter, he gives you $2.
And he gives you another Gatorade.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Oh my gosh. It is just really wacky. But I was on Wall Street Bets. Don't ever go on Wall Street Bets. It's terrible. It's a stupid subreddit. But I was on Wall Street Bets reading some fundamentals, and it was on oil. And this guy was like, anyone who's buying futures on oil right now, you're retarded. And I am only saying that to be accurate to the post. That's what he actually said. But he was talking about how there's this British company that operates off the coast of England, and they operate in the Atlantic Ocean somewhere, and they're doing fine because they can just ship another barge out to their little place that they drill in the ocean and fill that barge up with as much oil as they want. And if that one fills up, they can just get another barge out there. The reason why it's so difficult in America is because these places are landlocked. You can't drive a barge up to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You got to go through like 1,000 miles of straight up earth.
Yeah.
It's not happening.
Yeah.
And then if you want to get the oil onto a barge, you have to transport that oil from Oklahoma or from wherever it is. I think it's Oklahoma, but from like whatever in the middle of the U.S.
Yeah.
to a coast, and then store it on the coast on the barge.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's a very difficult problem that even the oil companies themselves, who are literally designed to store oil and then sell it to the market, are having a tough time figuring out. They're not able to figure it out, which is why they're like, hey, here's $40.
Yeah,
Take
yeah.
these barrels off our hands.
Yeah, exactly.
This is really unprecedented times. Like, this has never happened before in history.
Yeah.
Right? Where
It's-
oil
yeah.
demand has gone negative.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It means that gas prices are going to be cheap for a long time.
Yeah,
That's what it
I
means.
saw it for under $1 over on Mira Mesa
Oh
Boulevard.
my gosh, are you
like
kidding?
98 cents for a gallon.
Holy crap.
I was like,
I've never seen that anywhere in the U.S.
Yeah.
I've been to a lot of places.
Yeah.
The cheapest I've ever seen is like $1.20.
yeah, I was thinking about like just getting jerry cans and just filling them up.
Yeah.
Just ready to go.
No,
you know?
seriously.
Like,
go fill up your lawnmower. Go
yeah,
fill up everything.
Exactly. Hey, anyone got any buckets? You know? Like,
Yes.
Get it
Go to Home
ready,
Depot
yeah.
and buy some buckets.
Yeah.
You better hope
exactly.
you don't have a house fire, though.
exactly,
Just-
exactly.
That's
The
true.
garage is just full of loose gasoline, you
Yeah,
know?
exactly.
Yeah.
You're going to get high off of those fumes.
Yeah,
Every
exactly,
time you put
exactly.
shoes on in the garage.
Yeah.
Oil, man.
Yeah,
oil.
so-
it's a good topic.
Now, I want to take a look at how the coronavirus crisis is going to shape and transform the global geopolitical landscape, right? How the U.S. is going to look coming out of it, and how China, most importantly, is going to look coming out of it, right? And I'll basically start with how China is using the coronavirus to essentially shape its own narrative, right, and portray itself as the global benefactor, right, whose system is the best system to defeat this virus, right, and yeah, so it's basically hailed its victory, its battle against coronavirus as a victory, right, and it's had a massive propaganda campaign within the country and outside of the country to portray China's way of fighting this virus as the best way, and then once it's over the virus, right? Once it's done beating the virus, it has become the benevolent global benefactor that is helping all these other countries fight the virus, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, there's some there's facts to back it up, right? They've donated at this point over 4 billion masks to other countries, over 1 million ventilators, over 1 million sets of protective gear, right? They've donated a lot of stuff to these other countries, right? But a lot of China critics are basically saying that they're doing all of this in order to boost this propaganda campaign that is displaying China as this benevolent global benefactor who's coming in and saving everybody from their own mistakes, right? And one thing that they're reinforcing is that China gave the West warning, right? They announced that the arrival of this virus, and they kept it contained in their country for over 3 months, right? And they gave the West sufficient time to prepare for this virus, to get ready, get all the systems in place to fight this virus, and the West squandered that time, right? They threw that time out the window, they ignored the warning signs, they ignored the red flags, and now they're dealing with the consequences, right? UK, France, Spain, Italy, USA all have more cases and more deaths than China, which is a country of 1.4 billion people. Right?
Yeah, allegedly.
Allegedly.
All this stuff is, you have to really bear in mind the fact that China is not exactly known for its clarity with their numbers. I'm not saying that they don't know the numbers. I'm sure that Chinese officials know exactly how many people have died of this virus. But if you think about the narrative that they're trying to push, and if you think about the past where there have been countless cases of them downplaying numbers for the sake of not appearing as this evil entity, which I'm not saying necessarily that they are, but that's just they don't want to appear that way. So they're going to say, okay, these are the amount of people that died in this protest. These are the amount of people that that were at this protest. And so now they're saying X amount of people died in China from this virus, and people are like, wow, China is really handling this well. When in reality, we have no freaking clue what that number is, Eric. We have no idea.
But then I'd like to take a look at how the U.S. is dealing with that, right? There have been repeated cases of doctors and nurses being fired for reporting the conditions in the number of cases to journalists, right? In Philadelphia especially, several doctors have been fired from their jobs because they went to the press and they said, conditions are horrible in this hospital. We don't have protective equipment. We don't have the supplies ready to fight this virus, right? Tons of nurses are sick as a result of the coronavirus, right? And they've been fired as a result of that,
That's
right?
whack.
We are firing whistleblowers because they are reporting the real numbers, right? And I don't think that the U.S. is reporting correct numbers either.
I mean, I don't think that anyone is, because I think that they don't want there to be as much panic as, I don't think they want there to be more panic than there already is, because everyone is already so entirely consumed with this as it is that if the news that they were receiving was even worse than it is now, I mean,
it would get worse, right? The panic would get worse, right?
And also stocks, right? So if we keep reporting
it's people's
so
faith.
many deaths, then the stock market's going to crash again. If another 100,000 people die, then the stock market's going to inevitably go all the way down.
Yeah.
So we're really trying to limit.
Trying not to have an entire crash of our country.
We're trying not to scare everyone. Right?
And I'm sure China's doing the same thing. I'm sure it's not just the fact that they want to appear as this benevolent, this benevolent entity in the world. I'm sure that's part of it, but there's definitely a part of it that's control over the reactions of the people that are in their care, which is not illegitimate. I mean, it's not illegitimate to want to preserve your people from even worse panic than has already ensued.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen what society-wide panic does to a society, right?
Yeah.
Our economy crumbles, right? People's lives fall apart, right?
Yep.
All the institutions that we have in place start to look wobbly and unstable, right? Our leaders aren't sure what to do, right? And I think that when we look at the different cases of China's reaction to the coronavirus and America's reaction to the coronavirus, I think that this represents a real historical turning point away from America as the globe's leader and more in the direction of China, right? Because in past outbreaks, in past global crises, the U.S. has been the leader, right? When it came to HIV, when it came to Ebola, we were the ones that were funding the WHO. We were the ones that were sending doctors overseas. We were the ones that were on the front lines combating this virus, right? But now when we look at us now, not only aren't we're not combating this virus globally, we're not even combating it nationally, right? So we've completely ceded the seat of power in terms of the global leader, right, when it comes to global crises. And now all of a sudden there's a vacuum of power there, right? Trump has completely, not tried to engage in this fight globally, right? We've not sent anything overseas. In fact, we've actually co-opted other countries' medical shipments, right? Shipments of masks and protective equipment, and outbought them and taken them into the U.S., right? So we've completely ceded the position as the global leader in fighting this crisis, and China is filling that vacuum, right? China
but I mean, you have to think that it's
vacuum.
at the expense of their own people, though.
The Chinese people?
Yeah. And again,
Well,
if you're saying that these numbers are accurate, then no, it's not. Then it's like, okay, well then they are just being this benefactor. They are now the new powerhouse. But couldn't it be, and I'm not saying that this is the case, I'm just wanting to play devil's advocate here. Couldn't it be that China wants to fill the vacuum that America is going to inevitably leave in terms of responding to this crisis in the global world, in the globe? They want to fill that void of power that's left behind by America, because America's concerned with Americans, and they're going to outbuy people. They're going to do whatever they can to get the protective equipment to America, to get supplies to America, to keep the best doctors here, et cetera, et cetera. And China's like, okay, well now we're going to step up. We're going to send all sorts of things everywhere, and we're going to report these numbers that are low to make it seem like we're doing just fine. We're not doing this at the expense of our own people. But in reality, there's no boots on the ground reporters in China that are actually telling us exactly what's going on. I haven't seen a video of a Chinese hospital. We the only videos that we've seen come out of Wuhan have been like looking like they're out of a dystopian video game. Like people getting shot as they're running away kind of stuff. So that's probably what's actually going on in China is they're doing this for power for the nation at the expense of their own people.
Well, we don't know if it's.
We don't know. We don't know.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah,
but it certainly seems
but it's definitely
that
in
way.
China's interest to ship ventilators, masks.
Yeah,
around
I mean,
the
it'd be
world,
in America's interest to do it too, and that's why Eric is saying, well, there's a power gap. There's a power vacuum there. He's right. There is a power vacuum there, and China's filling it up very quickly.
Yeah, and before we look into China's specific response, and if their response is coming at the expense of their own people, I think that it's important to really flesh out what China's intents are. Right.
Yeah.
China doesn't want to rewrite rewrite the global order. They don't want to set up the vast system of alliances that America has. They don't want to be the country that's looked to in every crisis to come in and save the day, right? Because they've seen how it's cost America a lot of money, right? We are looked upon as the global police, right? And we are incentivized to get involved in every single crisis anywhere in the world because we are the imperial hegemon of the world, right?
Right.
What China wants to do is simply expand its power to the point where no country can stop what China wants to do, right? So they don't want to necessarily rule the world, but they want to make sure that no single country or no group of countries can obstruct China and its goals.
So
right?
they would rule the world.
Not necessarily, not the way America
No one
rules
can
the world.
obstruct them.
Right.
No one can obstruct them, but they don't rule the world.
Right, but there's a little bit of a difference there, right? Where America has military bases in every continent and almost every country, and they get involved, boots on the ground, in every crisis in the world, right? When a Islamic terrorist group is waging a guerrilla war in northern Nigeria, America's looked to intervene in that war, right? Because they are the imperial hegemon of that part of the world, right? Mm-hmm. As opposed to China, they might have a military base in Djibouti, but they are simply there to make sure that when China wants to do something, they get their way, right? So when China wants to build a railroad in northern Nigeria, they get their way. They don't get involved in the local matters of the country, right? Because they say, we don't rule this place, right? But they make sure that they have enough soft power and enough hard power to enforce their will on whatever countries they need.
I mean,
to
America
enforce
does
it
a
on.
very similar thing.
Uh-huh.
It's just with a little bit of a twist.
Yeah, a little bit of a twist.
It's a little bit of a twist because America is also America is concerned with getting the proper people. I mean, they have been in the past. I'm sure they still are now, but there's not as much recent activity like dethroning democratically elected leaders and putting in.
It happened in Bolivia a year ago.
A year ago, really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I haven't known about that, but okay, let's just say it happened a year ago. Fine. Yeah. America's interest is we are going to control you by putting in a leader that is sympathetic to us, and we're going to let you do your own thing, but you're not actually doing your own thing. And with China, you're saying that it's a little bit different because they're not like, we're going to put in our own leader. We're just going to say, this is what we're doing, and if you oppose us, bad things are going to happen.
Yeah.
Well, it's not necessarily because America's empire is very based. It's very hard power based, right? When you cross us, the CIA comes in and murders everybody that crosses us, right? We engage a military coup and we put in a military dictator, right?
Right.
As opposed to China, they don't have the hard power that America has, right? But instead, they have capital power. Right,
Yeah.
they have money
Right,
to
okay.
spend. Right?
Okay.
And so what they do is, let's take Sri Lanka for example. Right, they say, here's a $2 billion port. Right, we're going to build it for you. It's going to be built by this Chinese state company, and you're not going to refuse it. Right, because you're a poor South Asian country, right, with no, world class ports, and we're offering you a port. Right, it's world class. You're not going to turn it down. Right, and so they don't. Right, they get that port built. But they get it built with a loan, right? And China knows Sri Lanka can't pay back this loan. They're a poor country. They don't need that nice of a port, right? But now all of a sudden Sri Lanka defaults on that loan. And so China says, listen, we can bankrupt the country or we can get these concessions from you, right? Now all of a sudden China gets a military port right next to that regular port, right?
Yeah, it's
and all of
very
a sudden,
sneaky and subtle.
It's very sneaky and subtle, right? And instead of using guns on the ground the way America does, they use their financial muscle.
Yeah, but they accomplish the same thing.
It's the same function, right?
Yeah, it's the same outcome. It's just a different algorithm.
Yeah, but I think what's important to look at is that China doesn't want to topple the global order, right? They don't want to rewrite everything. They don't want to conquer the world and make all countries their puppet states. Instead, what they're doing is they're simply pushing on the wobbly pillars of that global order, right? Wherever they see an opportunity.
So what is the long-term goal then? If they're pushing on the pillars, then it seems like they want it to crumble.
They want global control. That's what they want.
Not complete control, right? It's not that China wants to take over the entire world.
They don't want everybody to become Chinese, but they want China to get its way.
They want China to get its way whenever it wants
to.
to.
So they want to be top dog.
They want to be top dog, but not the top dog that rules everything. It's a very minute distinction.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm getting your distinction, but still, I think that
they
want to be top dog. They want to be top dog.
Hegemon, right?
They want to be the imperial hegemon, just like America does, just in a different way.
Right. But I don't know. Let me ask you guys this: do you guys think they're getting there?
Yeah,
Yes.
obviously.
Like
They are definitely getting there.
America
They're
is on
definitely
its way
getting there.
out.
Well,
Like, have you
okay.
looked
I
at
don't know if you
Africa,
could say
right? So
America's
what's
on its
happening
way out.
What's happening in Africa?
We're losing our grip, guys.
Yeah, we are definitely
we're fumbling, we're slipping.
But that doesn't necessarily seem to be
tanked.
again. China is willing to do these things at the expense of people. America is willing to do these things at the expense of people too. The only difference is America's not willing to do this at the expense of American people. They're getting there. They're getting there. I think they're getting there.
Yeah, I mean, look at the
market right now.
Yeah, or the protesters that are saying, "Open up the country,"
and people are like, "No,
sacrifice the weak. We don't give a shit." Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then people are like, "No, yeah, we're not going to do that." And then China, I don't think that they give a rat's ass about their own people. I think that they want to be the military. I mean, they want to be the imperial hegemon of the globe. That's what they want.
Yeah.
And if they have to say, we are going to sacrifice our own people for that if that's going to be the price of this, I don't think they would hesitate at all to do that. And then the rest of the world, instead of getting outraged at what they're doing, which is completely evil, they're just going to say, oh, here are the numbers. Look at these numbers. These are the numbers. And then there's going to be a few people that actually get to see the truth. And then, we're going to silence some of them. We're going to do other things. I don't know if Gabe's ever told you this story, but my dad had a friend who was telling him a story about a business affiliate that was in China. And my dad's friend was in China and was talking at the dinner table to these other Chinese businessmen about this business affiliate that he used to have. And he mentioned his name and was like, hey, how's so-and-so doing? And everyone around the table grew silent. And the guy next to him leaned over and said, we don't talk about him anymore. He went away.
It's in the gulags.
That's what he said. He's either in the gulags or in the ground. Yeah. He's gone. That's what China does to people who oppose them. Now, again, we can get into the morality of it. It seems obviously wrong, but I mean, it is interesting. It is interesting to talk about that the morality of these kind of decisions.
Yeah.
The fact is, China's willing to do that. America's not willing to do that.
Yeah.
At least not yet.
Well, it's the idea that you can break a few eggs to make an omelet, right? Which it's morally wrong.
It's the ends justify the means. The ends don't justify the means. That's the principle you're working on. Then, of course, to make an omelet, you need to break a few eggs, and people are going to be like, that's just the natural way of things. China might say, if you want to be in power, you have to be willing to sacrifice even your own people. That's just the way it is. And America is very quickly getting to that point. Why? Because we're very quickly losing morality.
Yeah, well, so I think that it's important to make distinctions between the people as a whole and people as individuals, right?
That's true.
Because China and China's leaders have to be very cautious, right? Because when you rule a country of 1.4 billion people,
a heck ton of people,
you're sitting on top of a loaded bomb, right?
Yep. And
if you do anything to piss off enough of those people, that bomb's going to go off and you're going to be out of power.
Case in point,
right?
Russia.
Right, exactly. And the thing is that the Chinese system of government has set in place precedents and structures in order to maintain power over such a large amount of people, right? And for 5,000 years, they've been perfecting and tweaking that system and finding out how it works, what doesn't work, what systems should be in place to prevent the overthrow of a government, right? And what systems can we have in place that prevent social chaos, right? And China has perfected those goals, right? And they perfected the means in achieving that goal, right? And what they've found over this 5,000-year history is that once you allow individuals or local powers to start to stray from the national line, the party line, right, and start to pursue their own interests above the interests of the nation, you start the process of balkanization, right? And you have these local powers working in their own interests at the cost of the country's interest, right? And once that process goes on for long enough, those powers break away. And then the national government has no power, and then you're in the warring states period, where it's just a bunch of warlords trying to take each other over, mass famine, mass death. That's the worst, right? And that's what ultimately the Chinese system of government is designed to avoid, is the warring states period and other periods like it, right?
Yeah.
So what they look at it as is, listen, your dad's business partner's friend, right? He didn't obey the rules of the Communist Party, right?
Yep.
He decided to act against the Communist Party, or he didn't, invest his money in this certain thing that we wanted him to invest in, right? Now, that in itself isn't going to be enough to take down the CCP, right? Just one guy investing in something that he shouldn't be investing in, right? But once we allow that to happen, we've taken a step towards that social chaos, right?
Yeah, doing something in his own interest rather than the interest of the state. And,
Right.
And the
Well,
problem is they don't want you. They're going to say to you over and over again, it's going to seem like they're doing everything in your interest and that you are able to do everything in your own interest. But you were right. It only takes that one loan that they're like, hey, put your capital here.
Yeah.
You don't.
Yeah.
He goes away.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the thing with the, Confucian system of government is that you have a very specific role to fill. And wherever you are in life, wherever you're born, whatever your demographics are, you have a very specific path laid out for you, right? And you have to stay on that path. And the way to succeed in life and the way to move up in society is by staying on that rigid path, right? So as a businessman, yes, you make good investment decisions, right? You build a factory here, right? You make profits, you run a good company, right? But part of that path is that you obey your superiors, right? You obey the people in the CCP, right? And oftentimes you're in the CCP too, because that's the only way to succeed in the society. But you obey your superiors, and once you stray off that path by disobeying your superiors, you've now done the wrong thing morally in the Confucian system, right?
Right.
You've left your role as a person, right? Yeah. And it's extremely different from the Western, way of thinking, right? That every individual has their own demands and desires, and no one can question that. And you can do whatever you want. You can farm corn for all you want. You do whatever you want. But in China, it's very different, right? And it's all designed to maintain this massive country, right? That is constantly on the brink of collapse, right? And all these things that we see China do, that we say that's immoral, right? You can't just lock people up for, writing a bad tweet, right? Or you can't just, send journalists to jail for, calling out this certain, party official, right? All of that is designed to hold off the social collapse of the country, right? Because they see it as a domino effect, right? Once you loosen up a little bit, then they're going to take the next step, right? And then once you allow that to happen, they're going to take the next step. And then all of a sudden, you've reached Western constitutionalism, and China as itself just falls apart. And you're back to the Republic of China, where it's barely even a country, and it's a bunch of these corrupt bureaucrats just stealing money from the people,
Yeah. It's really a debate between individual freedom and country control. That's really
the solution is
you can't have both, because if you have individual freedom, then the individuals are going to choose differently than what the party wants as a whole. And
not necessarily.
Well, in the case of China, yes, it is.
In the case of basically everywhere now, yes, it is. And the reason why I say not necessarily is not because that's not what would happen, because that is what would happen. But the solution is not we're going to become like the West or we're going to stay like we are in the East. If China doesn't want to collapse, it has to do what it's doing now. They're doing exactly the right thing. If their goal is to not collapse, or to put it a different way, to maintain the power that they have and the system that they have. If they don't want to collapse, if they want to maintain the system they have to continue doing what they're doing. They have to continue putting people in jail for not investing in the capital that they want to. If you oppose the CCP, you go away. That is their MO.
Or at least do it enough that that's what all people think.
Yeah, and it seems like it seems like a very harmless thing, which is just sending out one tweet, saying that, oh, this party leader did a bad thing. But should you really be sent to jail and whatever they do for people, whatever they do when people go away, should they really just take a person away for sending one tweet? Well, it doesn't seem like it, but if the whole country started looking at that tweet or
thinking that it was okay to do the same thing.
It goes back to the whole the ends justify the means. The ends justify the means. You look at, we can look at philosophers up and down history, all the way back to Socrates, all the way up to Kant, and even some modern philosophers who always say people should never be treated as means, but only as an end. What that means is, if I want a desk to be built, and Gabe is going to build me a desk for $20, but I could get him to build me the desk for $10 if I threaten his family, which is also my family, so that would be stupid. But let's say that I threaten his family, and I'm like, hey, I think I want that desk to be built for $10. Why don't do you like your mom? How about you build me that desk for $10? Because we wouldn't want anything bad to happen to her. And then you're like, well, shit, I'm going to build this desk for $10 now.
Maybe even
maybe even for $5.
Yeah.
That is called treating someone as a means. You're treating him as a means to get you a cheaper good.
Yeah, we do that all the time in
We
America.
do that all the time. People are treated as means all the time. And it's wrong on every level, regardless if it happens in America, like our neighbor across the street who got fired in order for his company to keep $1 million that was rightfully owed to him. Not legally owed to him, but rightfully owed to him. Mm-hmm. And they just fired him because they're like, we could keep $1 million. They treated him as a means to make $1 million. And that's a pretty high incentive. We could fire this guy and immediately pocket $1 million instead of giving it to him. Mm-hmm. That's pretty high incentive. It doesn't get a lot higher than that.
Yeah.
We could silence this guy. We could silence him. We could make him go away to maintain our social order. Yeah. That is a very high incentive. Okay.
And so you get away with it through legal.
You get away with it because you are the CCP, and who are they going to go to? You are the leader.
Yeah.
So now what do we say? Is this actually wrong because their means is so high? Are we not utopians? Are we John Stuart Mill utilitarians? Yeah. Are we utilitarian? Are we going to say that the greatest happiness is going to increase if this person goes away? Mm-hmm. So we're going to make it happy. We're going to make it happen, and the greatest happiness is going to go up. Well, now we're back into philosophy. Mm-hmm. Now we're having to discuss: is it okay to treat people as a means? Mm-hmm. Is it better that the greatest happiness go up for everyone? Is that a sustainable philosophical system? Mm-hmm. Does it make sense? Is it reasonable to hold these principles? Because those are the principles that America operates on. In a lot of situations, in probably 99% of situations, that's what America operates on. Individuals can be different. Individuals, they're individual businesses. They might treat people well. They might treat people not as means, but as ends in themselves. They might have they might have a good, reasonable philosophical system. But America as a whole, the government especially, treats people as means all the time. China treats people as means all the time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is it reasonable? Is it good? Is it sustainable? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another discussion.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
That's the philosophical underpinnings for everything.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think that, when we're talking about, benefiting the people, right, and what's good for the Chinese people, it's important to look at the historical precedent, right? What happened to the Chinese people when the government was weak and foreign powers walked all over the country? Well, the Opium Wars happened. A third of the country was addicted to opium. Right. There were rebellions every single year, right? Corrupt bureaucrats were stealing money from the treasury, right? Every single European country invaded and got themselves a nice little trade port,
slice of that pie.
Right, exactly. And life for the Chinese people was objectively horrible.
Unbearable.
Right? And that's what led to the rise in popularity of Mao, right? He promised to kick the foreigners out. He promised to have a China for China's sake, right? And that's, in a lot of ways, why he beat the nationalists, right? First of all, the nationalist army was very corrupt, right? And generals were just taking money for themselves and acting like warlords, essentially, as opposed to the communists who had a, united front and acted like a united army. But once Mao won, for the first 20 years, there was no real increase in the standard of living for the Chinese people, right? They lived dismal lives, right? But at least the foreigners got out. At least there were no British people selling opium, and there were no French people coming in and murdering villages, right? There were no Japanese people coming in and massacring entire cities, right?
Yeah, you got to protect your people.
Right, exactly. And then under Deng Xiaoping, the leader that came after Mao, he opened up the country to the West, right? He started the process of industrialization.
Right.
He set us down the road that China is on now, right? And since that, China has developed incredibly, right? 80% of the people that have been lifted above the UN poverty line since 1949 when the communists won, 80% of those people are in China, right?
Wow.
Under the Communist Party, there has been a drastic increase in the material standard of living in China, right? And I've seen it myself, right? I went there when I was 8, I went there when I was 17, and I went there when I was 18. And every single time, I lived with Chinese families. I lived in Chinese apartments.
Right.
And I saw that they were wealthier every single time. And now, you can say, is that good, right? Is it
at
worth
what cost?
Is it worth having more useless consumer goods at the cost of a couple of journalists? Americans might say no, right? But the Chinese people,
Some Americans might say no.
some Americans might say it's not. We are very materialistic as a
Very
country, right?
materialistic as a country, for sure.
But that is the way to gain the support of the Chinese people, right? Is that you benefit a majority of those people. You make sure that they have better paying jobs every single year. You make sure that they are able to get cars when they weren't before. You make sure that they have housing. You make sure that they have food, right?
Right.
And the
yeah.
CCP has done that better than any other government in history. I mean, the increase in wealth over the past 70 years is unprecedented.
It is incredible.
It is unprecedented. No other country has shot from being a poor country where people are barely able to afford more than one set of clothes to one of the leading superpowers in the world where they have, cutting edge technology, middle class lives, and, mass consumerism at a national scale, And so I think, it's really important to really look at the utilitarian underpinnings of China, right? Because to me, the CCP is designed in a utilitarian way where they say, yes, 1 in a million people have to suffer because of our policies, right? They get thrown in jail. And I have friends that are now in jail because of what they did, right? I know people that are currently sitting in prison because of something they did that crossed the CCP, right? But the other 999,999
Right.
have had their lives improved because of the CCP's
So Eric, let me ask you a question.
Methods.
Yeah.
Would you be okay? Let's say you sent a text message to one of the people that would eventually go to jail, and then they went through the phone and found you, even though you didn't say anything that was revolutionary or counter to the CCP. They still decided to throw you in jail. Right, with no jury, extrajudicial, you're going right to jail. Right? Would you say it's but it's all for the betterment of the country as a whole, and maybe my suffering should allow another person to be, maybe more economically prosperous. Would you say that you would do that for the CCP?
Right. Well, I'm an American, right?
Yep.
And what China does to Americans is they deport them, right?
Yep.
When you cross the CCP as an American, you get deported.
Yeah.
Right? So I wouldn't be thrown in jail, right? So I have sent those texts. But if I was Chinese, I wouldn't associate with someone that crosses the CCP because I would know from a young age, every single part of my life has shown me don't do these things, do these things, right? Do well in school, don't associate with the criminals, right? Listen to your parents, don't go out at night and drink, right? Because every single institution in China is designed to imprint this mindset. And I would have learned from that mindset. Even me as an American going to Chinese school growing up, I learned that mindset, right? That, you don't talk about Tiananmen Square and what happened in 1988. Why? You just don't.
Yeah.
It's a bad idea. Nothing good comes of it. Don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Right? And why would you want to question the CCP when you have no power over them, right? It's better to, improve your life, right? Succeed in your role. And that role is not to question the government.
I think on an individual level, I agree with you
You
wholeheartedly.
got around that question.
No, but I think but that's important though, because I think on an individual level, I actually agree with you wholeheartedly. Because if you're the slave and your master is telling you do this, do that, and you go against him, bad things happen for you and your loved ones.
Why do it?
Why do it?
Yeah.
So it's not good for the slaves to rebel. Now, is it good to own slaves? Obviously not.
Right.
But why? Now we're talking again about the philosophical underpinnings. The question is not, what is the cost? Is this cost low enough for the reward? Is the cost low enough for the reward? The Chinese people have already answered that. I mean, the Chinese people have not answered that question. The Chinese government has already answered that question. The answer is yes.
Well, if the Chinese
cost
people,
of these people is worth it for the betterment of the whole. Okay? And now we're going back to what Gabe was saying about it's the individual versus the collective.
Yeah. Well, first of all, before we continue, the Chinese people do have the power to overthrow the government, right? There's almost 300 civilians for every one officer. Right?
I mean, but why would they when they have all this material success? When they have all this material what? They're not doing it because they're quote unquote happy, right?
Right.
Well, I would argue they don't have the ability because they don't have the ability
if everybody goes into the highway,
but
and just stands there, commerce will cease.
Yeah,
right?
but the problem is
And
they
that would
can't
be enough
organize.
They can't organize
Exactly.
because they're gonna get
So I would say
destroyed. They don't really
it's
have the power.
impossible
They
for them
potentially
actually
have the power, but they don't
overthrow it.
actually
They
have
can't
the power.
organize.
Hypothetically, if there was enough dissent And if there was enough will to overthrow the government, they could.
There's not going to
But
be
it
enough
takes
will to
collective-
overthrow the government
I don't
because the
know.
majority of people
They
are
could.
living in material success.
They could in theory, but I mean, I'm sure the CCP has already set up many laws to defend against just that.
Right, and they do day in and day out.
They do it. Yeah, they day in and day out.
They shut down
Go against
WeChat
that.
group chats,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
They imprison protesters, right? And yeah, I mean, it's you guys bring up some very good points, right? And when we talk about China, it's we have this perspective of Orientalism, right? That they're the other, right? They're the cultural other, and
To
they're
the
so
east.
drastically different than us. And
Yep.
how could you live like that, right? It's barbaric. It's
I
evil,
mean, I know that
right?
I know that I could live like that, and I wouldn't really think anything differently of it. It's just a question. Okay, we're gonna go into some
Wait,
deep
but
waters. Okay,
before
before
you
let
continue,
let me,
I just
finish
want
that
to
thought.
say that I'm not a Confucian, right?
Mhm.
I don't believe in the Confucian system, and I definitely don't believe in bringing it to America. I don't think America would be a better country if we had a American Communist Party that implemented the policies that the Chinese Communist Party did, right? I just believe that we live in different societies, right? And the Chinese society is written with a different foundation, right? There's different rules that underpin China than underpin America, right? And I want to explain those rules and explain the Chinese mindset to Americans, right? Because from the outside in, it seems barbaric, right? How could you imprison journalists? And how
Yeah,
could you,
for sure.
how could you do all this stuff? And I just want to show people how Chinese people think and how I've seen them operate both in China and as a diaspora here in America, so that we have a better understanding of our geopolitical rival. Because I think that if we continue to villainize China and say they're horrible, they're evil, the whole country is just savages, right?
Right.
We are taking a step closer to war with China.
For sure.
Because we're implicitly justifying it. We're saying they have death camps, right? They're basically the Nazis, right? It's horrible. Of course let's go to war with them, right? But that would be bad for America and it would be bad for China, right? We
And
have
now it's
different
even worse
systems.
because it's like, and they brought us this disease.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I just want to, really show that yes, we're different countries. We have different systems. We have different ways of thinking. But at the end of the day, we're all humans, right? And we all want the same things. We want success for our family, right? We want to live happy lives. Now we have different ways of getting there, and we have different ways of, constructing our society. But that doesn't mean that our way is better than their way, and that's it. Period. Right? There is merits to both ways. In a lot of ways, the American system works better, right? But in a lot of ways, the Chinese system works better as well, right? It's a gray area, right?
Okay, so now we're getting to
go
the
ahead,
meat
go
and
ahead.
potatoes of
Yeah,
it, because that last thing that you just said really brings me to the point that I made a little earlier about the philosophical underpinnings of these systems. America and China act on the same philosophical principle. They implement it in very different ways, but they act on the same philosophical principle, which is essentially utilitarianism, because they are interested in increasing the greatest total happiness. John Stuart Mill, one of the founders of utilitarianism, he studied under the founder of utilitarianism, Bentham. He says that there's a greatest happiness principle, and we should always work to increase that principle, even if it means self-sacrifice. Bentham and Benthamites are pretty hedonistic. They think that greatest happiness principle has to do with your base pleasures, your animal pleasures, and all that kind of stuff. Whereas John Stuart Mill tried to introduce more nuances to it and say, well, there's different pleasures. There's material pleasures for sure. There's sexual pleasures and all these other base pleasures for sure. But then there's also these higher pleasures, like learning and education and all this other stuff. And love might even be considered that, sure. Okay, and then now you look at the greatest happiness of the whole, and you say, you can throw all these numbers, and you say that there's 80% of the people in the world, rose above the poverty line after Communist Party were in China, whatever. You say that, you can talk about how you've been there and how these people live better lives because of this stuff, and how the majority of people are happy. And that's what we should look at is the conclusion, which is the greater number of people are happy. The greatest happiness principle tells us that we should always work to bring about the greatest happiness, regardless of the means that it takes to get there. That's a principle that China's operating on, and the principle that America's operating on is very similar. We just have the remnants of a post-Christian mindset which is still telling us in some areas that we should treat people not as means but as ends. That kind of haunting figure in the background, which is Christian philosophy and social teaching, is a haunt in the background. It's a ghost. It's a specter that is looking on at us and telling us we should change certain things of the way we act. And it's kind of like a nagging sense in the back of our minds. Whereas for China, you said it earlier, they've had 5,000 years of perfecting this craft of getting their country to be the greatest, regardless of the cost, regardless of whatever, etc. So, but are they operating on the same fundamental principle, which is the greatest happiness principle? To me, it seems, it's not a perfect analogy, or it's not a perfect one-to-one correspondence, but it does seem to be that China is saying we're going to go for the greatest happiness of the people. America is saying we're going to go for the greatest power, the greatest happiness, whatever. They just have there's different ideas of happiness. And the large part that they share in common is consumerism, right? And consumer goods. And that's a large part of their total happiness that they consider. Different people consider different things to be happiness, but yeah.
Right, that was adapted by the West from China, so China took the idea of consumerism from the West, right?
Well, I mean, I think that consumerism is sort of innate.
Consumerism is innate.
Want stuff. Give
but the
me more
economic
stuff.
structure.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
the economic structure of industry definitely came from the West.
Right. Not just the structure, but technology. Itself, right. I mean, that was a significant part of Deng Xiaoping's plan. Is that you want to open up a factory in China, of course, but you have to partner with a Chinese company and share all the technology. And then after 2 years, the Chinese company knows how to do the same thing, and they're just going to do it. You know.
Yeah. I mean, this happened to my grandpa, who he worked on this software for most of his life. He wrote 60 million lines of code back when coding was not cool. He was doing it, and he spent his life's work on this program which tested air conditioning units. He partnered up with a company in the US, and they said, you know what, F this guy. He's asking us to pay him X amount of money to use his hardware and his software per year. We're going to send this to China. They're going to reverse engineer it, and then we're going to buy it off of them for a one-time price and get to use it for free.
Yeah.
So that's what they did.
Yeah.
Company's name's Carrier.
Yeah.
And he sued them, and he won. Miraculously.
Nice.
Somehow he didn't get assassinated. I don't know how.
Yeah.
He had a heart attack, though, from the stress, but he didn't die. But that is the kind of industry like that that's the kind of thing that you're talking about, where they're just going to take all the advantages that they can from wherever they can get it. And they need the West industry to do that.
Yeah, and they've done it very successfully.
Very successfully.
You know? Yeah. But sort of back to Paul's prompt, right? That both China and America operate on utilitarian values at the base level, right? That's the foundation for the society. I definitely feel like China operates on utilitarian values, right? They certainly sacrifice the few for the many, right? That has been proven time and time again, right? But I'm much more cautious to say that America operates on the same values, because time and time again, I see American institutions protect the freedom of individuals and small groups of people at the cost of the happiness of much larger groups of people, right?
Yeah, that's interesting too, because we're so legalistic. I think that I think that these principles that directly contradict utilitarianism are written into our Constitution and are written to our legal system. So I think that there's a lot of remnants of it. But I'm talking more, not so much about the legal system, but more, or what even actually happens, but more just kind of the...
Talk about fracking, right?
The
we
mindset.
talked about fracking earlier.
Yeah.
That's an example of utilitarianism. We're sacrificing the environment and the ability to grow food for farmers in order to make a quick buck, right? So that's sacrificing the many for the benefit of a few.
Yeah, exactly. It's directly against that. And I mean, yeah, I mean that's what I see when I look throughout America. You know, we have the largest population of prisoners in the world, like by far.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Way more than China.
It's crazy.
Right?
Yeah.
And to me, that's not utilitarian, right? Throwing a guy in jail for 20 years because he, had a 10 sack of weed on him, right? That's not utilitarian, right? That actually hurts everybody, right?
Right, yeah.
It just benefits the DEA and, the military industrial complex to some degree, right? And, when we allow, billionaires to co-opt laws for their own benefit, right? Pay off lobbyists tons of money and donate billions of dollars to congressional campaigns so that regulations can be adjusted in their favor, right? And away from the favor of the people of America the way they were before that adjustment. That is, unutilitarian in my opinion, right?
Right.
And
it is.
And the thing is, it was designed that way. I
Yes.
think that this is something we've talked about in the past, right? That there's a myth in America that the founding fathers were altruistic, benevolent, deities, right? And they just did everything for the good of the American people, and there was no selfishness involved, and they were just these gods on earth that came here and just smacked down this perfect, untouchable Constitution. And wow, how could we ever do something that amazing, right?
Yeah, that's a very happy Enlightenment idealism that a lot of people have.
Yeah, exactly. But when I look at the Constitution, and when Howard Zinn looked at the Constitution in chapter 3 of his book, The People's History of the United States of America, he looked at it through a class perspective, right? That all of the founding fathers were part of the America's upper class, right? They were extremely wealthy. They owned plantations. They were industrialists, right? They were the very top of America's society, right? And they designed a government and a society that would have the appearance of a democracy and the appearance of a republic, right? Where everybody can vote, right? Or at the time it was only landowning white males, right? But eventually we would get there. Everybody can vote. You have control over the government. But behind the scenes, that control was co-opted by big money interests and the upper class of that country, right? And that was designed within the Constitution, right? Alexander Hamilton put that into the Constitution to give benefit to the industrialists, right?
Yeah.
Well,
and you see corruption all throughout American history
Mm-hmm.
because of that too, because they've purposefully not tried to set up a system that counters corruption,
Mm-hmm.
right? President makes $250,000 a year, or 250,
something like that. Not $1 million, that's for sure.
not $1 million.
Yeah.
So he makes like $250,000 a year. He's set up to fail. These big corporations are making billions and billions and billions of dollars. You think he's not going to accept any bribes or anything? It's happened time and time again.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ulysses S. Grant, for instance, he basically stole money that was going to go to the Indian reserves, like for blankets and food and basic necessities.
Yeah, yeah.
He stole that money. And there's been corruption all up and down American history, especially in the 1890s and from there. But
I think you called it out very well, which is it's not just that there's these remnants of Christian morality in the background. It's not just that people are still operating on some sort of good philosophical basis against utilitarianism. It's not that. It's that it's different than that, because the greatest happiness principle actually forces you to be altruistic if you're going to be consistent. Because if you're going to be consistent with that principle, then if you are, there's a really interesting example that I heard in a philosophy class, and it's quite hilarious. So I'm going to say it. Let's say that you're at a broadcast station and you are responsible for broadcasting the Super Bowl to millions of people who are watching the Super Bowl, and they're all getting their happiness by watching the Super Bowl. Now, let's say a piece of equipment falls onto this guy that's in front of you and starts just zapping the crap out of him, just electrocuting him. And you know that if you lift up this piece of equipment and get it off of him, something's going to short circuit and the game's going to stop broadcasting. The greatest happiness principle forces you to let that guy get the crap zapped out of him for the remainder of the game and then lift it off of him when the broadcast is over, simply because it would decrease the greatest happiness of the people, even if it would increase this individual's happiness if you lifted it off of him, because the Super Bowl would stop broadcasting.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyways, that is how you stay consistent with this principle. No one does that.
Yeah, and it's impossible to do that calculus.
Yeah,
Cause,
exactly.
Because there's no units of happiness that you can stack up. Well, every
Exactly.
single watcher of the Super Bowl has a 0.1 unit of happiness.
Yeah,
And this
it's
guy is
impossible.
losing 1,000 units.
That was
calculus.
that was a big critique of this principle, because they're saying you're basically trying to reduce this to unsolvable calculus.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
You're
even if
trying
they
to get
did-
out your abacus and say, okay, this is 2 ticks of happiness for this guy, 2 ticks of happiness for this guy, 20 for this guy,
Yeah.
and then minus 50. So I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Nobody can make those calculations. They're impossible to make in the first place.
Sure, and even if you gave them everything they could want, right? They have 100 happiness, right? 100% happiness. I would say still they would be dissatisfied.
No one will ever be satisfied on this earth.
Desire for happiness, you can't satisfy it, right? And so it doesn't matter the amount of material wealth or how much happiness ticks they get on the paper, right? I still feel that they would still be dissatisfied even if they got to the top material wealth.
Yeah. What's the point of bringing that up? The fact that it's impossible to be consistent with utilitarianism. It is actually impossible to be consistent with it. What's the point of bringing that up? So does it undermine the fact that I said that these people operate on a utilitarian basis? I don't think so, and here's why. Because when it ultimately goes down to treating people as a means to an end. And I know that this is a simple point, and I've hammered it home 100 times, but when you act out of self-interest, and even if you're the Communist Party and you say, well, there's 1 point however many billion people who live in China who don't act out of self-interest, but who act out of the interest for the CCP. I completely disagree with you. Yeah. I think that they are acting 100% out of self-interest, and
that's
you probably
the way
wouldn't.
Society is structured.
That's the way their society is structured.
You help us, you get
your benefit. Yeah, right? You move forward in life if you do what you're told. If you do what you're supposed to do, you move forward in life. That is acting out of self-interest. Yeah. People who don't act out of self-interest are the ones who get thrown in jail. Yeah. Those are the people who are saying, this is what is right. What is right is for me to report on this corrupt leader, regardless of the fact that I'm going to get thrown in jail, because the people have the right to know that this guy is doing whatever evil practice on them, and he needs to get called out for it. So I'm going to do the right thing. That is not acting out of self-interest. That's trying to be consistent with doing the right thing. I think that the main problem, not with only China, but also with America, but also with everywhere, is that people do not have a clear idea of what it means to do the right thing, nor do they have a desire to do the right thing. They don't have a desire to do the right thing because acting out of your self-interest is definitely a lot better than doing the right thing. It definitely makes you happier in the short term to do the wrong thing, even for the right reasons of like, well, I want to be happy. And if I want to be happy, then I want to have more money. If I want to have more money, then I need Gabe to make me this desk for $10 or even $5 instead of $20. How am I going to make that happen?
Yeah. Or fire your neighbor.
Or fire my neighbor so I can have $1 million in the bank. And now I'm happier. People don't have a concept of what it means to do the right thing. And when you don't have a concept of what it means to do the right thing, you're going to do the wrong thing over and over and over and over and over again. And if you're going to try to justify it philosophically, doing the right thing, then you need to be able to come up with some sort of principle that allows you to justify it. Yeah. The only principle that would allow you to justify that is utilitarianism. That's it. Yeah. And so you look at the base fact, people act in their own self-interest, and then if they try to justify it, then it's utilitarianism. But then you point out the utilitarianism is inconsistent with their actions. And then their entire structure crumbles. So now that we see that people act out of their own self-interest, and acting in your own self-interest, purely acting out of your own self-interest, is not sustainable. Like reasonably, it's not sustainable because it's impossible to justify acting out of your own self-interest in every way. And even people who didn't want to deal with bringing religion into this whole situation agree with that. Like Kant. Kant has his two categorical imperatives, and the second iteration is you should never treat people as a means but only as an end in themselves. That's one of the categorical imperatives. Yeah. Of Immanuel Kant. And so you look at different philosophers who have said doing the right thing is always right, regardless if it decreases your short-term happiness. Aristotle said this. Plato said this when he was talking about the beast, about how if you give in to your lower passions, if you give in to your lower pleasures, then they rule you, and you want the man to rule. There's three parts of yourself. There's the beast, there's the lion, and then there's the man. And the lion is like when you get angry at stuff, it's your spirit, it's your fire, it's your heart. And then the beast is when your passions control you and all this kind of stuff. And when the beast is in control, your passions are in control. Someone just started up a weed whacker. Yeah. Anyways, I don't know if I'm getting into too deep of waters, but I guess if I had to say TLDR, the too long didn't listen is this. People act, it's not the weed whacker, that's not the TLDR. The TLDL is People act out of their own self-interest, and it's not sustainable philosophically. It's not sustainable reasonably. You cannot reasonably justify acting in your own self-interest all the time.
Yeah.
And people who act only in their own self-interest and not to do the right thing, which here's the crazy part about this. Doing the right thing is always in your self-interest, ultimately. Maybe not in the short term, but always in the long term. Doing the right thing is always in your self-interest in the long term. But doing something for the sake of your own self-interest is always wrong. That's the craziest principle about it. Because if I'm doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, it is in my best self-interest.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, do you think that there's any way to overcome that hump, right? The fact that individuals are constantly incentivized to act in their own self-interest, which ultimately leads them down the wrong path. Is there
the
any
way to overcome that hump is to habituate virtue, and the only way to habituate virtue is to start initially with a solid philosophical background,
right?
because if
it sounds like you're transitioning to Christianity.
I
right?
mean, no,
like,
because I am, but only in
We've
a
talked
way
for
because
2 hours now and haven't brought up Catholicism, so it's
it has
coming,
to start.
It's coming, you know.
I'm not even necessarily advocating for Christianity at this point. I'm just advocating for reasonability, because any reasonable person can know the truth. That's the basis that I operate on. Any reasonable person can know the truth. The truth can be known by anyone. There's no such thing as subjective truth. It doesn't make sense because of this one simple, this is a little soundbite. Truth can't be subjective because if truth is subjective, then the truth that truth is subjective. And someone else's truth, that truth is actually objective, would be subjectively true to them. Then truth would actually be objective and not subjective. So to say that truth is subjective is self-defeating.
I didn't get that, but let's talk about that briefly, because it's something me and Gabe talk about often, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like, it is kind of rooted in your guys' religiosity, right? That there is one truth, right? And that truth is God, and it's Jesus, and it's the Bible, right?
Well, the truth is.
Well, here, let me give my.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Sorry, you go.
That we
I've
have
had too much coffee. I'm talking too much.
I know. That's all of us, that we're back to truth and objective truth.
Truth.
Yeah.
If you have a disagreement on subjective and objective truth, then really you can't discuss anything afterwards until you lay that ground rule.
Yeah. But we've never overcome the disparity between our positions.
That's right.
Yeah,
we have
but
to
we
see
still
some
talk.
of our...
Yeah. But so, to me, I see that we have imperfect perceptions of the world, right? We have imperfect senses. We can never see everything. We can never know everything. Even if we dedicate our lives to just accumulating as much knowledge as possible, we'll never experience everything.
Yes, you're right about that. We will never.
We never.
We will never, but we can never is a different situation.
Well,
there's a difference between the potential, and then there's a difference between what is potentially real and then what could happen.
Yeah.
So someone like,
hypothetically, if someone lived infinitely and dedicated,
you could just say
life,
it like this: we have the potential to know things.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have the potential to know. We have the potential to know a finite amount of things, right? We can agree on that basic principle.
Yeah.
There are a finite amount of things to be known in the seeable world, in the knowable world. Therefore, we can know the finite number of things to know in the knowable world.
I would say there's an
infinite amount of things to know about the world. Okay, so
because every question you answer only brings up more questions.
That's true,
right?
So if you, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So now
you can never reach the end.
If
of
we
the
want,
road,
okay, if we really want to have
it's
this,
an infinite road that just goes into the horizon.
You're right.
You can keep running.
Can you know? Okay,
but
how
you'll
about
die
this? Can you know
the
all
end.
that there is to know about one particular thing?
I think that no. I think that
there's always something else.
There's always something else to know, and you can look at people with PhDs that study just one species of toad, right? And they just learn about that one species of toad. They can spend 1,000 years just learning about that toad and reading about what other people have read about that toad, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, there's still going to be a little bit more to know about that toad, and
totally
you will
agree.
never
You'll never be fully satisfied with your knowledge that you have.
Yeah.
And would you also say that people who end up studying something very deeply end up realizing that they know less about the topic the more that they know about it, the more it's like walking further and further into a room where your field of vision opens and opens and opens.
Yeah.
And no matter how many details you can pick up in this vast expanse, the further in you walk, the further the expanse grows.
Totally.
And you realize that you know actually less. I agree with you on that principle. I totally do.
And so so I think that, and this is kind of a hard point to make, right? Because we as humans want to believe in truth, right? And we want to believe that we know the truth because it feels safe, right? That we know what's going on and we can rely on that knowledge and continue with our lives, right? That's our innate drive, is to say that I know the answers to these questions, right? And that's the way I live my life. It's okay. We're good, right? And like I know how stuff operates and I don't need to know anything more, right? But to me, the truth is all knowledge, right? And it's all connected, right? And because you're never able to get all of that knowledge, right? You're never able to fully complete the picture of truth, right? There was always going to be one puzzle piece missing. And because you don't have that one puzzle piece, you don't have the full picture, right? And someone else might have a different puzzle piece, right? And they, have a different part of the picture, right? But neither of you have the full picture, right? And you can
agree.
And you can complement each other, right? You can talk about the things the way we're doing now, to try to get a better picture and try to get that puzzle completed a little bit more. But because everybody has imperfect knowledge and they never know the entire truth, and even if you dedicate your whole life to learning more of that truth, you'll never be able to reach the end of that road. Then our truth is always a little bit imperfect. Now, is that to say that we should be complete nihilists and never discuss anything because everything is fallible? I don't think so, because ultimately the pursuit of the unreachable pursuit of truth is still a worthy pursuit, right? And it's impossible and we'll never get to the end of that road. But I still think that is something that we should engage in as humans, right? And it makes us better, and it makes all of society better. Now we'll never get there.
Yes.
But it's a good road to travel.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Are you and the person who also has a different piece of the puzzle, are you working on the same puzzle?
I think so, because we live in the same world, right?
And we operate on the same basic principles.
Yeah.
We both have a mind, right? So even though you are, there are certain things which each person, you could use the medieval term, intellect.
Yeah.
Each intellect, you could say that maybe any potential intellect, Martians, any potential angels, any potential intellect must operate on certain principles in order for any knowledge to be known at all. These are called the axiomatic truths. And there's not a whole lot of them. One of them is the principle of non-contradiction, and which simply says that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same way. So this wicker basket cannot both exist and not exist at the same time. That is logically contradictory. It's logically impossible that is the case. That this wicker basket is existing right here and not existing right here at the very same time. We know that when you say it like that, our intellect immediately grasps it. It's like, yeah, that's just completely true. Like, that has to be true in any possible world for any possible intellect to concede to that truth. That is one of the axiomatic truths that we operate on. Anyone can know that. So that's what we mean when we say objective. Objective means that has to be true regardless of anyone knowing that it is true. Even if there is no subject to know that is the case, that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect, the principle of non-contradiction, it is still going to be true. That's objective truth. So when you're talking about this puzzle, and I really like that analogy, that some people have these puzzles, the bottom left corner, some people have the bottom right corner, some people are in the middle, some people are on the side. We all lean in different directions with where we go with our pursuit of knowledge.
Right. And some people only have a couple pieces. And
some people have a half a piece.
Yeah, exactly.
Some people don't even know that there's a damn puzzle.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay?
Exactly. Yeah.
Some people have a lot more of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Okay? They're still working on the same puzzle. That puzzle, we would say, if we're talking about objective truth, that puzzle would be there even for the people who don't know that there's a puzzle there, right? So even for the people who don't realize that what they're pursuing is truth, that what they're pursuing is knowledge, that there is a such thing as objective knowledge, people who are operating in the world are still operating on the same principles. They're still the same puzzle.
Yeah, yeah.
That's all that objective truth is. It's not saying that if you don't think a particular way, then you're wrong. If you see a different piece of the puzzle, then you're wrong. It's not saying that. It's just saying that there is a puzzle. And if you say that no matter how hard you try, if you have the bottom left corner piece, no matter how hard you try, if you try to say this piece goes in the middle, it won't. No matter how hard you want, no matter how many people believe that, you could get the entire world to believe that the bottom left corner piece of this puzzle goes in the middle, and it won't, because the puzzle is the way that the puzzle is.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we agree that there is a puzzle, right? There is objective truth out there. But I think that the real question that arises from that, or at least for me, is because we can never have the objective truth. No person can ever have the whole puzzle.
Maybe the fullness of the
you
truth.
can never have the full objective truth. You can have pieces of it. Is anything we say ever objectively true? Because I think that's where my real issue comes up, is when someone claims that something they believe and something they say is objective truth. Because I say, it is out there, right? Somewhere out there is a fabric of objective truth. That puzzle exists, right? And we're all trying to piece it together. But if anyone claims that their part of the puzzle is the full puzzle, I think that they're trying to pull the wool over my eyes, right? And so I think that
it's good
even though theoretically the puzzle does exist, practically it
you can
doesn't
even say
it
instead
doesn't
of theoretically, really it exists.
It really exists, right? It's out there, right? But I can never see it, and I can never hear it from somebody else. So I have to treat everything like it is subjective truth.
Why do you say that you can never? So you say that you can never see the fullness of the puzzle,
right?
And I agree to it. I agree to an extent. I think that you do need to bring in a certain amount of theology in there if you do want to say that you can see the fullness of truth. I think that as a Catholic, you could say that God is truth, and that God is the basis of all truth, and any knowledge whatsoever, if it is really truly knowledge, if it is really truly that objective truth that we all seek, then it comes from God, and it has its foundation in God, and God is its resting place, its origin, and its synthesis. God is the origin of all knowledge. He is the example. When we find knowledge, when we perceive knowledge, we are actually perceiving God in a way, his examples in a way, and ultimately all knowledge is supposed to lead us back to God. That is the grand Christian design. It's like a going forth, an example, and a synthesis. You could put it, St. Bonaventure puts it as this, it's a I forget the exact word that he uses for the first one. It's a going out creation. That's what he says. I'm pretty sure it's creation, then it's exemplification or an example, and then synthesis. So all things are created from God, all things come forth from him. His example, his being, his essence is exemplified in his creation that he creates, just like an artist who paints a painting. Part of the artist is in that painting. You can see the artist in his painting, his mind, the way that he works, the way that he views the world, that kind of stuff. In his painting, God creates. We can see his example in creation, and then it ultimately leads us back to God. So if you want to say that you can have the fullness of truth, not that we can understand the fullness of truth, because none but God can understand God, and God is the fullness of truth. So we say that no one can understand the fullness of God, because no one else is God but God. There is but one God.
Yeah, so my question is...
But we can still have the fullness of truth as a gift. That is the thing. We can, not that we can understand it, not that we can be the fullness of truth, that we can understand the fullness of truth, none of that, but that we can, in a way, receive the fullness of truth by a grace of God. And that is what Catholics call the beatific vision. That is heaven. That is heaven. Is a constantly evolving race. It's like a free fall into the vast and infinite expanse of truth himself, which is God. So that's the beatific vision. That is the fullness of truth. So I agree with you before you say your piece. I agree with you that no one person and no person anywhere, no amount of people, no collection of knowledge will ever come close to the fullness of truth, because the fullness of truth is infinite, and there's no such thing as saying we come close to the infinite. It's meaningless to say that.
Yeah.
There's always going to be something else to know. There's always going to be these extra things. But does that mean that we will be unsatisfied? No. If God satisfies, then we will be satisfied. But then does that mean that we cannot make progress? Does that mean that we cannot make real progress? That we can know real truths? Is that what that means? I say no, and I say no because we have these basic structures of the world which are interwoven into our minds, interwoven into the fabric of reality that we can know to be true based purely upon reason and logic. Like the laws of logic themselves, that if A, therefore B, A, therefore B, that's a logical syllogism. We can know that to be true. We immediately grasp it on our intellect, and we know that to be true regardless. So then we make syllogisms. We say, if it rains, it pours. It rains, therefore it pours. Like, we can know these kind of things logically, and that, if you treat that as the basis of your knowledge, of your real knowledge, you've gotten really far already, because a lot of people don't even understand that.
Yeah, well, my question is, so if you admit that we can't fully grasp anything, wouldn't that halt some sort of progress towards building the actual puzzle and making it as clear as possible? Because if you admit that, well, each one of us has a different puzzle piece that fits somewhere into the puzzle, but no one can claim that their puzzle piece actually is the left corner, then the puzzle will never be completed, right? So when mathematicians, they have to agree that 2 + 2 = 4 in order for them to move on to calculus, right? So I see the same thing happening where we have to admit some forms of objective truth in order to build upon them and learn more about the toad or whatever you want to call it. So by admitting that we could all be deceived in what we believe as true, sure, but there has to be some fundamental truths that we can collectively agree upon in order to progress as a whole, right? And so if you admit that there's some objective truth that we should hold, then you ultimately admit that some objective truth does exist. Okay, and if you admit that some objective truth does exist, then that means that there's a hierarchy of truths. Some truth is subjective and wrong, and there's some truths that are objective and true. And so if you admit that there's some truths that are objective and true, then those objective truths must be put in place. So it's not merely a matter of, well, he has his own subjective truth and I have my own subjective truth. But if some objective truth does exist in the world, then that means you are obligated to share that objective truth, even at the sacrifice of people's subjective truth.
Yeah, well, I think that ultimately, and to sort of rooted in, the idea of God, and that God is truth and truth is God, that even those objective truths that we use as building blocks for the pursuit of knowledge, they are human, right? We reached those ourselves. We came to those truths ourselves, right? And our perception is inherently flawed, right? We cannot see everything. We cannot know everything. So even though those objective truths form powerful and important building blocks in the pursuit of knowledge, I think that it's important to say that they're not perfect and
even
they're not
they themselves
infallible,
could be fallible,
right? That they even those truths that we hold so dear and are so important, like 2 + 2 = 4, even they can be questioned.
Nothing
and
is
even
above
they
scrutiny.
need to be perfected upon, right? Because even though we've used them in the past as building blocks, in order to have better building blocks, essentially, we need to constantly scrutinize and constantly question, right? So I think that...
I gotta pee, but I'll be back to respond to
all right, Paul. All right. Yeah, I mean, I think that you bring up a very good point, right? That in order to pursue truth, in order to, build that puzzle, like we've been saying, we need to have certain building blocks, right?
Yeah. And if you don't have those building blocks set in place...
You can't do anything.
You can't do anything.
You can't do anything.
I'm taking a very pragmatic view of this. It's like, well, we have to admit some things as true, because if we don't, then where does the discussion follow? Because then everything is up for interpretation, right? And we do this every day, where we have to say, well, I believe this. I believe this in order for me to continue in a certain way, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in order to, live your life, you have to believe things. It's people can claim to be nihilists and say that everything is meaningless and nothing is true, but in order to function in society and in order to continue to live your life, you got to believe something, right? And I think that it's sort of a hard dichotomy for me to work around, right? Because even though I say that everything is fallible and nothing is true, I still have to take certain things as true in order to live my life, right? And it's a hard dichotomy for me to work around, because philosophically, yeah, I believe that everything is fallible and nothing is true. But at the same time, like I was saying, I still need to believe some things in order to function.
Yeah,
you know?
I just don't think it's logically sound, because if you say that there's something that's objectively true, right, but it can be perfected, then it wouldn't be objectively true.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is that we can use certain subjective truths and use them as objective truths as building blocks, right? We can temporarily say, listen, we're not going to question that right now. We're going to leave that on the table, right? And we're going to use it to continue the pursuit of truth, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we can never take it off the table. That doesn't mean we can never question it, and that doesn't mean we can't recognize that it's fallible and it's imperfect, right? We can still use it as a building block, and we can, say certain principles like, the golden rule: treat others as they, you would want yourself to be treated, right? We can use that as a building block for philosophy and how we should act, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at that rule and really question it and say, listen, are there some
I totally agree, but
imperfections
to admit that
here?
it's objectively true would mean that it is not subject to scrutiny.
Let's just put it this way. How about this? Let's bring it down to the bare freaking bones. Okay?
Bare freaking bones.
The
Paul
bare
and I just cracked
freaking
open a
bones.
cold water, by the way.
Cracked open a cold one, but it wasn't a beer. It's too early for beer.
Yeah. It's a little sparkling drink.
Sparkling water. So the bare bones. So let's say this. Let's just do some mind games real quick. Let's exercise.
Mind games.
Let's exercise our reason real quick. Okay? There's this statement: God exists. Now, this statement has a negative, which is not God exists. Or to put it not in this logical terms, God does not exist. So if you're looking at this in terms of logic and you want to represent this logically, you can say X or not X. Okay? X or not X. Now, X, God exists, is God exists and God does not exist. That is completely, entirely exhaustive. There is no other possibility, because existing or not existing are mutually exclusive categories. So anything that exists necessarily does not exist.
Yeah, and God can't exist partially either.
Nothing can exist partially. There's no such thing as nothing can exist partially. There's no such thing as a partially existing thing. It either exists or it doesn't exist. There's no other alternative. And whenever I bring up this principle, people are always like, yeah, well, what about Schrodinger's cat, huh? Schrodinger's cat can both exist and not exist at the same time. So what about that, man? And I'm like, well, it is either one or the other. And then when you measure it, if you found out, oh, now that I've measured it, it doesn't exist. It doesn't not exist and exist at the same time. It can't. That's impossible. It could be one or the other. And then when you measure it, it is one or the other. But it's not both at the same time. Yeah. Before you measured it, it's not both at the same time. Yeah. Before you measured it, it's one or the other, and then when you measure it, it is one.
Yeah,
that example doesn't. That example doesn't hold. So, let's agree that even if you didn't want to agree with this, it would still be the case that things can either exist or things cannot exist. Right?
We say physical things.
Well, anything. Anything can either exist or not exist, right? Let's say, like, okay, now we need... So that's a good point, because we might want to refine what we mean when we say exist, because I would say that
it's
Frodo
easy to talk
Baggins...
about cups of coffee. They exist or not. But
let's talk about Frodo Baggins, okay? Does Frodo Baggins exist? Well, in a way, because he exists in a story, he exists as an imaginary character. I would say that he has what we would call a potential existence. And that would be a category of being called metaphysically contingent. That would fall into a category of being called
as well, because he was in movies.
Well, you could say that the person Elijah Wood actually exists, and that he played Frodo Baggins in a movie, but that Frodo Baggins himself, the actual character of Frodo Baggins, does not actually exist, but potentially exists. But he still exists, but it's a potential existence. So some things actually exist, some things potentially exist, and some things don't exist, but could exist. That's okay. Some things don't exist actually, but could exist actually, like Frodo Baggins. We can imagine a world in which Frodo Baggins is actually real. We can imagine that world. So we would say that he has a potential existence. And then we can imagine a world in which Frodo Baggins does not exist. We don't have to imagine that very long, because that's our world.
Yeah.
Frodo Baggins does not actually exist. So he can exist and he can not exist. That's called contingency. That's what contingency is. It's the ability to exist and not exist at the same time. That's contingency. Okay, so this can that I'm holding in my hand right now, me, you, everything here could exist and it could not exist. But it does. Therefore, it actually exists right now. But we can imagine a world in which this can does not actually exist. We can imagine it, right? It's logically possible that this can does not exist. Therefore, it's contingent. So we say that all contingent being, which is all actually and potentially existing being, falls in the category called metaphysically contingent. It's a simple enough category, metaphysically contingent. These categories come from Duns Scotus, by the way. Then we can now think of, okay, so and then here's the point of that. Any truth which you speak about that which is metaphysically contingent, any truth that you speak about things that are metaphysically contingent is also contingent upon the state of affairs of the metaphysically contingent thing. So that is the statement. Now let's actually take an example. Philosophy is always better with examples. So let's take an example. The statement, if it rains, it pours. Okay? That's just a classic logical example. If it rains, then it pours. Okay, that's a if-then statement. Now the truth value of that statement is true regardless of the contingency of if it has actually rained or not. The truth of that syllogism does not depend upon it actually raining outside. Okay? The truth of that syllogism is true regardless if it rains or not. Now, if we want to say, has it poured, then we have to say, well, has it actually rained? Or you could just say this: if it rains, then it is wet. Let's just say that. If it rains, then it is wet. That makes more sense than if it rains, then it pours. But if it rains, then it is wet. You look outside and you say, well, is it wet? Therefore, it has rained. That's not true, because that's logically inconsistent, because it could be wet because I sprayed my hose on the ground, right? So we say that truth is, we say that if it rains, then it pours. That is it logically follows that's, okay, let me back up. That statement is logically sound. Like the structure of that statement is logically sound. If X, then Y. That's a logically sound statement. But X actually being true, X actually happening, is contingent upon the contingent world. Okay? So X actually happening is contingent upon the contingent world, because if it rains, raining is a contingent thing. It could rain, it could not rain. It's contingent. So any truth that we want to say about a world which is contingent is also contingent upon that world. Yeah, you guys see how that follows?
It's X.
I know I led us on a weird path on that, but that was
it's X therefore Y, Y therefore X, and that's wrong. Right?
That is wrong. Yeah.
That's the
logical structure. So that has a logical structure to it, right? If X therefore Y, then you say Y.
Therefore X.
Therefore X. Yeah, that's not true. But if you say X therefore Y,
it is true.
Comma X, then you can infer that Y is true.
Yes. Okay.
But the whole point of that was talking about metaphysical contingent being. I just wanted to bring that logical structure into it as well. But going back to the metaphysical contingent, that truth, the truth value of X, whether an X is a 1 or a 0, let's just put it that way. If X, whether X is a 1 or a 0, is contingent upon the reality that X itself is actually a 1 or actually a 0. So a 1 means that it's true, a 0 means that it's not true. Let's say that X is equal to it rains. Then I have to look outside and I have to say it rains. Therefore, X is a 1. Now I can plug that into my function and I can say X, therefore Y. So now I can say it rains, therefore it's wet. But that is contingent. The logical structure is not contingent, but the truth value, what you actually get as your output, is contingent on whether or not x is a 1 or a 0. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's metaphysically contingent, and that's logical truths. Now, the logical structure itself is not contingent upon the truth value of x. So the logical structure x, therefore y, the logical structure itself does not have anything to do with the contingency of x or y being the case. So if it rains, then it is wet. That structure, x therefore y, is a necessary structure, because regardless of what x is, regardless of what y is, regardless of what you mean by those terms, that structure, x therefore y, is necessary to be, if x is true, then y. And if, okay, let's put it this way. If x is true, and it follows that if x is true, then y is true, and x is true, therefore it follows that y is true. That structure of arguing, the most simple structure there is of argumentation, has to be true in any possible world.
Yeah,
it is
you
necessary
have to,
that is true.
First off, you have to prove that we can actually identify x. That's
No,
where
let's just abstract. We're just totally abstracting the form. Logic is not concerned so much with proving certain things or not proving certain things. The only thing that they're not proving contingent things. The only thing that logic is concerned with is, I have this argument here. I'm going to break it down into its basic form. Like if I say, if it rains, then it pours. That gets more complicated because it's like, well, if it rains, sometimes it sprinkles and all this other. Well, they're not concerned about that. They're just saying, let's just take out the terms. Let's take away the actual content of the argument, and let's just look at what the underlying structure is, which is x, therefore y.
Yeah, but if
X,
you're going
therefore
to
y.
apply that structure, then you have to first make certain that x is actually raining, and then
Exactly.
That's why that's where I think kind of our whole debate is
That's
about
where
is
the
whether or not our
contingency-
senses can be deceived.
Well,
Because
that's where the contingency part of it comes in.
Yeah, but in order to say x, therefore y, you have to first say that x exists, and x is. If it rains, I can see that it rains, and I can be certain that it rains.
And not only that, but you have to prove therefore.
Therefore,
right? You have to prove
You have to prove that it logically follows. I agree with you. I agree with both of you on that. And, and you guys are right on the contingency aspect of things, which is if you actually want to prove x, therefore y, then you need to prove x. You need to prove that it follows that y. I get that. But I'm saying that the structure, the logical structure.
Yeah, it's totally correct.
If x, therefore y is correct.
Yeah.
And it has to be correct.
Yeah.
There is no way that if you say if x, therefore y, x, therefore not y, no, that's not true. Well, why is it not true? Because the laws of logic dictate that it is not true. Well, then if you want to argue against the laws of logic, that's a whole nother debate. But I think that any reasonable person would just look at that statement and immediately grasp, like, yeah, that is the case. That is the case. It is true. And you assent to that truth. I mean, you can not assent to that truth if you are really obstinate and you want to not assent to that truth. That's fine. You'd be wrong, though. I think that most reasonable people would still say, yeah, that's true.
Definitely.
That's true. Okay, so now moving on. The next part of my grand scheme. There are some things which are logically impossible for any potential world. Any potential world, logically impossible. These are called metaphysically impossible. Metaphysically. What does metaphysically mean? Metaphysics is the study of being qua being, or the study of, you could just say the study of being, essentially. The study of what it means to be. So what does it mean to be metaphysically impossible? This would be something like a round square. Or a square circle, you could say. So contained within what it means to be a square is the notion of not being round, right? Or contained within the notion of what it means to be a circle is not being a square. So to say a square circle exists is automatically absurd, because it's logically impossible that a square circle could actually exist. It's logically impossible that is the case. So that's something which is metaphysically impossible. It's impossible that exists. Now, On the opposite end of the spectrum of the metaphysically impossible, there's the metaphysically necessary. There are the things which are absolutely necessary that it is the case. That this, okay? It is absolutely logically necessary that it is the case that a thing cannot both exist and not exist at the same time in the same respect. It is logically necessary across all potential universes. That has to be the case. It is logically necessary that responsibility presupposes freedom. That's another one of those axioms. Responsibility presupposes freedom. You cannot have responsibility without being free. You would not hold a blade of grass responsible for giving you a cut because the blade of grass is not free. Responsibility presupposes that. If someone cuts you and you hold them responsible for it, you're presupposing that they did it freely. If someone is sleepwalking and they cut you, you don't hold them responsible for it because they weren't acting freely, right? Responsibility presupposes freedom. That is a truth that can be known. So, and that has to be the case in any world. What you mean by freedom, responsibility has to presuppose, responsibility presupposes freedom. So what you mean by responsibility, you have to be presupposing freedom. So anyways, that's the metaphysically necessary. Now, how does God factor into all this too? We say that God is metaphysically necessary. His being is necessary. His being in existence is necessary. And what is the grounds for this? Things come into being, things go out of existence. Material things come to be, material things go out of existence. Immaterial things come to be, immaterial things go out of existence. Now, I don't want to have an argument now about proving the existence of the soul or the immaterial things. I think that you can reasonably object to it as well, but I think that you can also reasonably say that there is an immaterial soul, and there's a lot of very good arguments for it that there is an immaterial soul. So let's just presuppose that immaterial things can exist. Let's just say that for the sake of this argument. So immaterial things can exist, material things can exist, immaterial things cannot exist, material things cannot exist. They can go out of existence, they come into existence. This is called volatility. Right? They're volatile. Their existence is volatile. Their existence is not the reason or the cause for any contingent thing's existence cannot ultimately be itself. The reason for the cause of any contingent thing's existence cannot be itself. So I did not cause myself. My parents did not cause themselves. My grandparents did not cause themselves. My great-grandparents did not cause themselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes on forever until you get to, let's just say evolution is true, which is a whole nother can of worms to open up, which it might not be, but let's just say evolution is true. It goes all the way back to that single-celled organism, goes all the way back to the little flotsam floating in the dust, whatever. That itself did not cause itself. Then you go all the way back to the stars. The stars is where things are created. That did not cause itself. Then you go all the way back to the Big Bang. The Big Bang did not cause itself. Some scientists are saying, okay, well, maybe Stephen Hawking was trying to prove this forever because he was logical and he knew that if he could prove that the Earth caused its own existence, then he could say God is not necessary. And he's right. But he couldn't. And he died unhappy because of that, because he could not prove satisfactorily that that the universe could cause its own existence. And he tried to say that it was because of antimatter and matter colliding in this particular way. Well, what caused that? What caused that to come into existence? Did that cause itself to exist? It's an infinite regression of causes. And if there is no first cause, if there is no primary cause which has its own cause internally, it is the own cause of its existence. Or another way to put that is, its existence is necessary.
Yeah.
Then there is no subsequent causes, logically. If you're building a tower, and you are at the top of the tower, and you can't see the bottom, you automatically assume that there is a bottom to the tower.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
If there is no bottom to the tower, you can say, well, why doesn't it just stretch on to infinity? Because then there would be no top of the tower. There would be no top of the tower without the bottom of the tower, because you cannot build from the top down. You cannot build an infinite series of causes. It's called an infinite regress. So
Yeah.
an infinite regress is impossible when you're talking. I mean, there are infinite series. There are potentially infinite series. I completely concede that. But this particular type of infinite series, an infinite series of causes and effects, is impossible. There has to be a floor. There has to be a first principle.
Yeah. that's
And
God.
the philosophers say this first principle is God.
Yeah. So let me bring up my question about that.
Long-winded argument, right?
You made it though. And
Yeah.
it's very good,
Made it, yeah.
right? So I agree that, there cannot be an infinite list of causes, and there has to be a first cause, and logically that must be God, right? Because right now we can't see anything past the Big Bang, so we leave that to God, right?
Well,
But-
no, not necessarily that, but even if we could even imagine, let's just say that we can imagine that something else caused the Big Bang. So
Yeah.
let's say that we can see past it.
Yeah, and then you would just have one more step in the list of causes.
You can imagine that an infinite number of causes came before the Big Bang. You can imagine that before the Big Bang there was an infinite number of universes, that each had their own infinite number of causes before that.
Yeah.
You can imagine that, and I
Right.
would say I completely imagine that with you.
Yeah,
But I'm just saying,
but there's an end to
you
it.
have to have a first principle which created all of this. Otherwise, you wouldn't have arrived at this present moment logically.
Yeah. Well, so the distinction that I'd like to make and see what you guys think about it is that I see the point that there has to be some first cause,
Yeah.
right? And logically, it's God, right? But is it possible to distinguish between a God, or can we know whether God is just that first cause and then nothing more? Or is God, the Christian God that is omnipresent,
Great point.
omnibenevolent?
Yeah.
Is it, is it possible that God was just the guy that lit the match and then left? Or is God, like Christian theology says, ever present in everybody, constantly judging, constantly present, constantly there? Because to me, I can acknowledge and see the point that the first God does exist, right? So there is a first
There's
cause.
a first principle.
Right, there is a first principle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God is ever present and has a list of moral rules and a list of judgments and put his son here on earth.
Totally.
I don't think that follows logically, right?
No, not from that argument. No.
Yeah.
That's why
So
you have to
give
bring
me-
in tons of other
give me
arguments.
the
Yeah,
other
I mean,
argument, yeah.
but the building block is there is a first principle, and this
Yeah.
we call God. So
Yeah.
that Saint Thomas Aquinas says at the end of when he says QED, which means basically I have proved it, thus it is proved. He says, and this we call God. And what he means by we is the philosophers. So the philosophers call this first principle God. So let's just operate on that basis first off. We can just say, okay, there is a first principle, and this first principle we call God. Cool. There's not more than one first principle, because then there would be a first and a second. There's only one first principle, so God is one. So we can deduce a few things logically from that. Namely, God is one. There is only one God. And secondly, that this God must himself be infinite in power.
Well, can I give something
Yeah,
real
go
quick,
ahead,
right?
yeah.
So, just a hypothetical, and I'm going to argue for what's it called? Not monotheism. What's the opposite of monotheism?
Polytheism.
Polytheism, right?
Yeah.
There's the God of the universe, right? The God that created the Big Bang. But then there's another step in the causes that to me seems almost impossible, and that's the first life on Earth, right? That first cell that was alive. How did that happen? Was it just
Yeah.
that an infinite number of molecules knocked together and eventually they knocked together in the right way?
It seems
and made
absurd to say
DNA?
that.
Right? That seems absurd to me.
Yeah.
But could that be a separate God, the God of life on Earth and the God of the universe itself, right? Is there a separate God that made that spark happen and made that first cause happen? Because to me, they could be the same God, obviously, but they could very much be different gods.
Yeah.
Right? The same way, there's the Greek god of the sky and the Greek god of the ocean, right?
Right,
There's no law saying that, they are automatically the same God. To me,
No.
those are different illogical steps in
You're totally
the
right.
process that brought
and
us
I'm glad
here.
you said that too, because it makes me refine what I'm trying to say. So, yes, they could be different gods, but there has to be one God which is absolutely necessary. His existence is his essence, and he is first and foremost. There has to be a first, because even if you say that this first principle created another God, which then created life on Earth, the first principle would still have to be first, because the first principle would be his essence would have to be his existence for him to be necessarily existing. Like for God to be the cause of his own existence, his existence would have to be necessary, right? And we know that there's no such thing as an infinite regress of causes. Therefore, we know that there's a first cause. And so now that we know that there's a first cause, we say, what is that first cause like? Well, in order for it to be the first cause, it has to be necessary. It has to be all powerful, which can also be deduced from that. But then you say, okay, well, what if there's another God who came later in the steps? Then he would be created.
Right.
He would be created. I mean, but could say
he could still be divine.
But he could still be. But he wouldn't be the divine, though.
Right. Yeah,
he wouldn't be the divine.
Right. So
I mean, you can think of
but
almost like
that's the way pantheons work, right?
Right.
That there's one patriarch God, but there's other gods below him, right? His sons, his daughters, right? All that sort of stuff. You know, Zeus is the head god, right? But Hades is still.
But they didn't have the. They didn't quite have the notion that Zeus is the first principle. They didn't.
Right.
I mean, but there was
born from Titans, right?
But you do see in the what's the creation story that Plato? No, it's not Theaetetus. It's gosh, I'm remembering the name of the. I forget the name of the book, but in Plato's creation account, he does have this idea of this kind of first principle, but he doesn't call it Zeus.
Zeus came later, but I'm just
later.
using
But
that
yeah,
to,
but like,
to illustrate
but
the point, right?
yeah, but I mean, it's not inconsistent to say that there could be lesser gods, but I think it might be confusing to use the term gods, even if you want to call them that, but then you need to use capital G if you're referring to the one God, which is the one first principle. So I'm saying that there can only be one first principle, but I'm not going to necessarily say that there can't be lesser gods based on that argument. Based on that argument, I won't say that there can be lesser gods, but based on other arguments, I will say there isn't. But I mean, and then if you believe in the Christian faith, then you believe in angels, which are essentially like lesser gods to us humans. They basically are lesser gods. They have lots of power. They're incredibly smart. And if you actually look, a lot of pagan worship in the past, actually looking back on it in hindsight, appears to be demonic worship, like actual worship of demonic entities. And that is not inconsistent with the Christian worldview of like, well, these people believe that they were worshiping lesser gods. Angels are basically lesser gods. They have superior intellects. They have superior power. They have superior everything. They do have control over earthly goings and comings. They, demons do actually have control over whether or not your crops survive. You sacrifice. The demons want blood. All that kind of stuff. Like you see the pagan worship. It's like consistent with that. So to say that there can be lesser gods does not contradict that there is a first principle necessarily.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. I don't know how much longer you guys want to continue the conversation of God, but I mean, in objective truth, it is really important stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like it's something that we lack in our society today, is that we've sort of left behind the big important questions, and everybody just keeps those answers internally, right?
Yeah.
And we don't really spar or debate on these big questions. Instead, we focus on the little ones. Is In-N-Out better than McDonald's? Is what kind of car you drive? Is it better to drive a pickup truck?
Gonna have?
Yeah, exactly.
Thicker, thin
limes, right?
Yeah.
We focus on these unimportant questions. But while we're on the topic of God, I wanted to sort of see your guys' take on and hear you guys' take on liberation theology, right? And this is something that I heard at a Catholic mass, right? And I know I'm not supposed to go to mass and take communion because I'm not Catholic, but I don't really respect those rules, to be honest. And I went to mass, right? It was a while ago, and it was because my dad's masseuse was baptizing her child, and so she invited our family, which is a little strange on face value. You invite one of your massage clients to your kid's baptism, but
it is a bit strange.
Do whatever, right? and so we showed up. It was at the Mission in San Diego, down in Mission Valley, right?
Yeah, it's a really pretty church.
Yeah, really pretty church. And so we just showed up, and we went into the church and sat down, and then there was no baptism. We just sat through mass, and we just sat through mass. And apparently the baptism was in a smaller chapel in the back, but no one told us. And so we just sat through regular old mass and, took communion and all that sort of stuff. So, all that good stuff. And it was a good experience. I mean, half of it was like in Latin, and I didn't understand that. But, the English parts I enjoyed. And basically what this priest was preaching was, looking back on it, liberation theology. He was talking about early Christian communities and how they were built on, communalist principles, right? That we take care of each other. And, within this community, we worship God, but we also take care of each other, right? And that, in order to embody the ideals and the principles of those early Christian communities, which some could argue were, in a way the most Christian because these were people that directly heard from Jesus, right? They worshipped him, or not worshipped him, but, heard his sermon and heard his teachings and established communities.
They definitely worshipped him.
Directly from those teachings, right? And in a way, he's saying that in order to embody those principles of those early Christian communities, we need to be more communal, right? And we need to help each other out in our communities. And
Definitely.
we need to fight against the sin that is in all of our institutions and in our society, right? And the most, important sin that he pointed out was greed, right?
For
that
sure.
we have allowed greed to take over our society, and we allow our institutions
Take
and our
over our
industries to run based on greed, right? And we allow that, and we support that system. Now, we may not support it individually as Catholics, right? We may not, embody that, sin personally in our own lives, but by supporting a system that is based on a foundation of greed, we are implicitly supporting greed as okay, right?
Right.
And without standing against societal greed and an institution that runs on greed, we are tacitly giving it our support, right? And we may not be greedy in our own lives. We may give to charity, and we may, live charitably and support our communities. But by not taking a hard stance against greed in society, we are implicitly sinning, right? And I want to hear you guys' take on that. And this is a theology that, give a little background, right, was started by a bunch of Latin American priests, specifically Gustavo Gutierrez, right? And he saw that, listen, the church isn't a regressive institution. It is not a supporter of establishment hierarchies, right? In fact, the church in a true sense, and Christianity in a true sense, is a sword for the poor, oppressed people of this world. It is a sword that encourages people to stand up against systems of oppressive hierarchy and fight for societies without the embedded sin that exists in our society now. And it should be a tool for oppressed people all across this world to fight against their oppressors, right? And he cites, some specific Bible scriptures, specifically Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1, or Matthew chapter 10, verse 34, which describe Jesus as a sword, right? That came and disrupted the social hierarchy and made it more just and more in God's likeness, right? And he was not somebody that came in and supported existing social structures. And he was not somebody that, justified the unjust systems of the day. Instead, he came in and he pointed out the sin that was inherent in those systems, and he fought to change it. And if we want to live in Jesus' likeness, we need to fight the inherent systems of sin that are ever present in our world now, right?
Yep.
Which means not supporting them, standing up, being vocal about those sins. And the church should be a vocal opponent of sin in every society, right?
Absolutely.
What do you guys think?
That's a great topic.
Yeah.
Gabe, you want to start off on that? Anything to say?
Go ahead, Paul.
Okay.
I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think that 98% of what you said,
Yeah.
I agree with.
Right.
And I think that there might be like a little bit of a nuance
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
to the position that might need to be shifted a little bit in order for me to completely agree with it. But firstly, I want to say, don't go to Catholic Mass and receive communion unless you're Catholic, simply because it is Jesus. It is his body. It is his blood. And if you don't believe that, then that's okay. But to respect the proper worship that goes on at Mass, it is important that you don't receive the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings without properly understanding what you're doing, without being properly initiated into the Catholic faith, even if you don't believe it's true, simply to be respectful to the other people.
I understand. And
That being said, I know that wasn't out of
regularly.
malice.
Yeah.
I know that wasn't out of malice that you were like, I'm going to do this to spite people.
Yeah.
You're not that kind of person.
Yeah.
But just for anyone who might be ignorant, that is, to be properly reverent to what is actually taking place, or even if you don't think that it's actually taking place, to be reverent and respectful to the people who do think it is actually taking place. So that being said, you bring up a great topic, which is Catholics are countercultural. Catholics do not follow the society that they live in. If the society that they live in is not following Catholic ideals.
And before we continue, can we agree as a precedent that America is sinful? Right?
Yes.
That our institutions and the way our society functions, it functions on a foundation of greed, and we allow that greed to happen.
Absolutely.
We allow the Walton family to steal from their workers.
Yeah.
And we
Always
allow
bring up
Jeff
the Waltons.
Bezos to hoard wealth like just like smog, you know. And by implicitly allowing that and not taking a hard stance against it, we're allowing that greed to continue.
I completely
and
agree.
we're moving further and further away from Catholic principles as well.
Yeah, I mean,
we're not becoming more and more connected with the Catholic Church. We're moving further and further away.
So here's the
You
thing.
can just look at abortion in America, for one.
Catholics are not called to take up the physical sword against these evils. They're not called to do that. The Crusades were not a mistake. They weren't some artifact of the past. The Crusades were not a mistake. The Crusades were a fight against a known evil in the land in order to reclaim the Holy Land, etc., etc. That's another topic.
They're
but let's
also
just say
oppressing Christians as well.
right. And we can talk about different aspects of the Catholic Church and history and whether or not they were right or wrong, but all that is irrelevant to this point. Catholics, by and large, are not called to take up the sword against this kind of stuff, the physical sword. The power of Catholicism is like a seed that is planted in the soil. This is the parable of the mustard seed, right? Faith is a seed, is a mustard seed, which is literally so small that you can barely see it on the end of your finger. That's how small a mustard seed is. It's like dust, essentially. Mustard seeds are like dust. That is what faith is. And it will grow into a mustard tree. It will grow into a tree which is larger than any person, and other people can come into the shade of this tree. Right? That is what the faith is supposed to be. It's planted into the soil surreptitiously. It avoids detection largely. It is sneaky, right? And it binds the hearts and minds of these people that follow it to do certain things and to act in particular ways. Otherwise, lest they go against the dictates of faith and the commandments of faith. One of these is fighting the vice of greed. And fighting the vice of greed on an individual level as well as an institutional level. And the ultimate solution is that each person internalizes these commandments, these dictates, in their own heart. Jeff Bezos becomes a good practicing Catholic. That is the solution. The solution is not to kill Jeff Bezos and to take all of his money and then redistribute it to people who actually deserve it, or to pay his workers more or whatever like that. I don't think his workers are justly compensated. Sure, whatever. That's fine. The solution isn't to kill him. The solution isn't to force him to give his money away. The solution is to stand up for what is right, to stand against what is wrong, with all the means that you have at your disposal, without harming his physical well-being or attacking his personal character, publicly defaming him or any of that kind of stuff. But you fight against what is wrong for the sake of what is wrong. You don't want to fight against individual people and defame them. Like if Trump is doing something that is wrong, you don't want to say Trump is evil, Trump is this, Trump is that. You want to say what Trump has done was wrong. Then you have a real argument, because you're arguing against something that has actually occurred, not a person's character. When you argue against people's character and you start defaming people, then it very quickly becomes a brawl of cats that are kind of just hissing at each other, and you don't really get anything done. So this kind of liberation theology of we need to liberate the oppressed people, Catholicism can be the sword of the poor. Yes, it can. And yes, it should. And yes, Catholicism should protect the poor. That was one of Nietzsche's actually criticisms of Catholicism. Nietzsche said that Catholicism is basically propping up the weak, and we shouldn't prop up the weak. We should let the weak die. The strong will live. And the Übermensch will come when we let all the weak die, and the strong will take over. And Nietzsche, he's crazy.
Paul,
but
I want to correct something. You said liberation theology, I agree with. You can't agree with liberation theology.
I don't
because
agree
it's a
with
very one of the principles of liberation theology is we have to somewhat kill the people who are oppressing our religion, right? In South America, it was used as a justification to basically kill greedy people, right?
I don't think at its core, right now, I'm not a liberation theologian, right? And not even a Catholic, right?
Yeah.
But I think that it doesn't have to be violent, right? Let's say all Catholics in America formed a voting bloc and said that we will only vote for policies and representatives that want to make the lives of the poor materially better, right? However, you want to accomplish that, whether it's taxing Jeff Bezos or raising the minimum wage, however they want to do it, right? We will only vote in this way. It's not violent, right? But it's a way of changing society and the institutions in society to make it less sinful, right?
If that is what it is, then I completely agree with that. Like that is, I mean, if that's actually what it is, and it's not a justification for murder and a justification for coups, then I completely agree with that.
It has been used as a justification for coups and murder.
Well, Catholicism has been used as a justification for many evils as well, but that doesn't make it wrong. Catholicism at its core is 100%. It is the only truth.
But believing liberation theology is wrong.
I don't. I mean, okay.
It's not a concrete philosophy. Like it's not like there's one book called Liberation Theology and that's the whole thing.
It's an interpretation.
If we're getting hung up on that, if we're getting hung up on, okay, well, if it's an interpretation of the Bible, that's a little bit different because there's only one interpreting body of the Bible, and that's the Catholic Church.
Yep.
So liberation theologians can shove it up their ass because the Catholic Church has given us the true and only interpretation of the Bible. But if you are getting hung up on that word, then we can just say, well, do we agree with certain principles? I agree with the principle that we should fight against sin in institutions. I agree with that principle. How we go about doing that, we may have to discuss. It will vary in various situations. I think that the principle that we should fight against sin. If you walk down the street and a woman is being raped, you fight against the rapist. Anyone will do that, right? I mean, well, not anyone, but any good person would do that. That's a very clear, concrete example of I'm stepping in to fight against sin. It becomes a lot less clear when it's like, am I going to vote for this policy that's going to tax Jeff Bezos 78% or 80% or whatever? And am I going to vote for this policy? Is that really going to be what's best for the people? Is that really what's going to be best, et cetera, et cetera? And that's why you ultimately have to defer. You have to defer a lot of your judgment to the authorities of the church, which is ultimately the Pope and his bishops and the bishops' priests. And so when you defer your judgment to these people, these leaders, you read something like Leo XIII's encyclical letter of talking about how the evils of capitalism and talking about the evils of communism and socialism. You read this stuff and you think, okay, wow, so there are real problems with socialism. There are real problems with capitalism. There are real problems with communism. How do we fight against these? What these are now, how do we actually implement this how do I implement this in my own life? How do I try to enforce this in other people's lives? If you're a policymaker and you make a policy that allows for capitalist greed, then you are either implicitly or explicitly culpable for the greed that then ensues. Right?
Definitely.
And we don't want to be even tacitly responsible for any sin. And so standing up against sin as it appears in all areas of life, as much as is prudent, as much as we can, while still respecting the freedom of other individuals, that seems to be a good principle to work on to me.
Yeah. So I totally agree with what you're saying, right? And there was one particular point that you made that, sometimes Catholics need to defer to the judgment of the Catholic hierarchy, popes and bishops and stuff. So I want to read you a quote from Pope Francis, our current pope, and this was recorded when he was a bishop in Argentina, right? While he was, having
Jorge Bergoglio.
Yeah, exactly. So, and before I start this, liberation theology is colloquially called the option for the poor, right? and that's what he's referring to in this quote,
Uh-huh.
right? The option for the poor comes from the first centuries of Christianity. It's the gospel itself. If you were to read one of the sermons of the first fathers of the church about how you treat the poor, you'd say it was Maoist or Trotskyist. What do you guys think about that?
I think that Pope Francis says a whole lot of things, and what he says a lot of the time can be either misinterpreted or misunderstood, and he's not precise enough with his language, and that is a fault of his. I think that by and large, I want to believe that his intentions are good, but he has definitely said a lot of things that make me cringe and that make me kind of hesitant.
Yeah.
But what I mean when I say we need to we need to defer to the judgment of our popes and our bishops and our priests, specifically our popes and our bishops, and specifically the Pope when he speaks from the office of the Pope. So this is probably, if I had to guess, this is like an interview, right? Is this an interview, or is this, because this does not sound like an encyclical letter that he wrote?
No, this yeah, it was an interview.
It's an interview,
not even an interview. He was talking with an author at his house.
Okay, so breakfast. It's even more. Okay, so listen,
even less formal, right? Yeah.
Even less formal than that.
Yeah.
When I mean we need to defer to the judgment, and we can keep talking about this quote because it is interesting.
Yeah,
but I want to make this. I want to put this huge disclaimer onto this. This huge caveat, which is, we defer to the judgment of the Pope when he speaks as the Pope.
Right.
When he's speaking here, this was even when he was still when he was even Bishop Jorge Bergoglio.
Yeah.
So he's not even. I mean, he has the authority of a bishop, but he's not even exercising his authority as a bishop here.
Yeah. He's
just speaking as a man. So I would never defer to the judgment of Jorge Bergoglio as the man. Never. He says way too many things that are completely contradictory. He says way too many things that are contradictory to what the true Catholic Church actually preaches. But whenever he speaks as the Pope, whenever he speaks from the office of our first Pope, St. Peter, he never errs.
I see. That's an important distinction.
It's an important distinction.
I wasn't really aware of that, so thanks for bringing that up. Right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about the quote.
Yeah, let's talk about the quote.
Right? What do you guys think about that?
It's a problem.
That the earliest Christian communities, which in some way we can argue were, in a way, the most Christian because it closest to Jesus' preachings, and without the institutional influence of the Roman Empire or the Papal States as a country or any of the political leanings of the church. This was just Christians with no power being Christians as they learned from Jesus, right? Without the power of the papacy, without the necessity of bolstering Roman government, without the necessity of making political alliances in the Italian peninsula and striking out against France, all the later things that, in my opinion, in a way, muddled Christianity, right? Threw some mud in that water, right? Because there were certain political necessities for the Pope and the Church to do. And we can argue about that later. It's a separate discussion, right? It makes things more complex, right? But to me, the earliest Christian communities, right, the people that actually heard Jesus speak, right, and actually worshipped him and worshipped God in the way he taught them, and they formed these communities right after Jesus died and was resurrected. To me, those are the most pure Christian communities, right? Because they're not influenced by any sort of power. They're not influenced by any sort of desire for power. Those Christian communities and those first priests, I don't know. I'm saying the same point over and over again. But do you think that his interpretation, Pope Francis, I forget his name as a bishop, but
Jorge Bergoglio.
Yeah. Do you think that his interpretation of those earliest Christian communities is correct? Right.
Is that the full quote? Did you read the full thing? I think I may have cut you off.
No, that was the whole thing.
That was the whole thing.
Or
So
that's what I
said that it's Maoist. He said that
it was Maoist or Trotskyist, right?
Maoist
Which
or Trotskyist. It may seem that way. That's what he said. He said it seems.
Yeah, or he said that if you were to read one of the sermons of the first fathers of the church, you'd say, or about how you treat the poor, right? So on that specific aspect of those sermons,
about how you treat the poor,
you'd say it was Maoist or Trotskyist.
Okay. I have probably like 900 problems with that, and the number one problem is because it's incredibly imprecise, and he doesn't back it up at all, and he doesn't even mention which early church father he's saying. I mean, I know this is just kind of a colloquial thing. He's just like speaking with a friend, an author friend, or whoever.
And I could have done more research, but this was me just jotting down notes.
Yeah, I mean, but this is a good conversation starter.
Yeah.
So I would just say that I would want to ask him specifically which fathers, because there are many, specifically which sermons, and I would like to read some of them because maybe I would see his point. I think that in the way that the poor should be treated, I think no one has treated the poor worse than Mao or Trotsky, ultimately.
Well, Trotsky never really had power, right?
Yeah, that's. I mean, yeah, I guess it's just his
Stalin,
principles.
right?
Yeah, Stalin's right. You're right. You're right.
But
I mean, I guess his principles maybe of like. Are you talking about like?
It's.
Are you talking about
when you
principles
say,
of community, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, when you say Maoist and Trotskyist, it's not about the people.
It's not about the people. Okay?
It's about their ideology.
Their ideology. Okay.
Right. And Trotsky. Had a the difference between Trotskyism and Stalinism is that
huge.
Stalin believed in socialism in one country. Right?
Right.
We're going to perfect socialism right here in the USSR,
Yep.
and we're not going to try to spread it. We're going to make Fortress Russia, right?
Yep.
And it's going to be perfect and it's going to be awesome, right? But we're not going to try to spread it. Trotsky, on the other hand, believed in global revolution and that we should spread the revolution and that we should topple all hierarchies in the world as fast as possible and liberate all oppressed people, right? As soon as possible in our power, right? And we're gonna create this wave of revolution across the world, and we're gonna free all the oppressed people, right? And very idealistic. You're like, how are you gonna do that? What are the institutions you're gonna set up?
What does it actually
right?
look like? How many people do you kill?
Yeah, exactly.
How much blood is spilled?
It's very hard to determine, right? But I think at the end of the day, the thing he talks about in relation to, how you treat the poor is Trotskyist or Maoist, is that the poor should be in power, right? And that the poor should have no chains of oppression, right? There should be no landlords, weighing down on the poor. There should be no bill collectors hounding the poor for their, little money. There should be no, any sort of institution or person coming down and bearing down upon the poor, because I'm going to quote, sermons in badly here in the gospel badly, right? You guys give me a little leeway here, but that, God saw through the poor, or that the poor were closest to God.
Yes.
And that the poor were God's people, right? And so they should be upheld, number one, and there should be no chains of oppression on the poor.
Yeah. Well, there's
I don't know. I'm butchering it.
No, that's
right?
fine.
I mean, no,
but
I
but
think
but I want to. I just want to spur conversation.
You bring up very valid points.
Yeah.
There's a sin of usury, which basically says don't collect interest on loans.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason why you could say that poor people are oppressed by the rich is because they are in debt to the rich. They have some debt to the rich, right? And so
they have debt to capital.
They have debt to capital, right? So they may owe the loaner money, right? And so they are ultimately under the person who they owe the money to. So yes, that would be a sin of the loaner to take interest on a loan. Right, but it's really complicated.
Yeah.
I think that's right, and I think that if you really want to know a really good answer to this stuff, you should look at distributism, which is propagated by G.K. Chesterton and
Thomas More.
Really, Thomas More?
Yeah, his book Utopia.
So distributism and also Chester Belloc. The distributist society basically says that we should distribute resources and land in particular to the greatest number of people that we can. And it shouldn't be one corporation which says we have rights over all this land, be it government, be it whoever, where I can't even go to the woods of Pennsylvania and build myself a log cabin without having first bought the land from someone. And that notion is kind of strange. And also, essentially it's saying it needs to be easier for people to buy homes. It needs to be easier for people to, if they are being financially responsible, to be free of debt and to be self-sufficient and to have enough assets to where if they need to say, I have to take 3 months off of work, which is really not that long of a time. I need to take 3 months off of my work because my wife is pregnant and she's ill from her pregnancy. And these 3 months, she needs me at home to care for her and to care for the children. I need to take 3 months away from my work. You would get fired in most companies if you came to them and said, I need to take these 3 months off. That is not in support of the family. That is not in support of the family. And for people, they don't have this freedom, which we want to speak of precisely because of what Gabe was saying, is that they're in debt. I don't have freedom if I don't even own my own damn house. I have to pay a mortgage on a house for my entire freaking life to a bank who owns my house. The bank owns my house. I pay a mortgage on it. I'm paying off a loan. I live here on a loan. If that is the way that you live, then you're not free.
Yeah.
And that's the way that our society is set up. It's set up that way on all aspects. If you drive in your car, you don't own it. If it's new, if you didn't pay in cash for it, you owe the bank owns your car.
Right.
The car dealership owns your car. Whoever else owns your car, you don't own it. If you are financially responsible, you're fiscal. You're frugal with your money. You save what you can. You don't make unnecessary purchases. You don't buy superfluous things. You don't buy anything that's gaudy or extravagant. You try to live a simple, modest life and make a decent living, and you work hard. You should not be beholden to banks. You should not be beholden to car dealerships. You should not be beholden to the government. You should have your own, you should have enough freedom to take a few months off of work when your wife gets sick, to spend enough time with your children to where they actually grow up with a father and not some figure who comes in at 5 o'clock and falls asleep because he's worked to death each week.
Sure.
Comes in at 7 or whatever. All that kind of stuff. All of that is not conducive to a healthy life or a healthy family. So the distributist model is just saying that this is the ideal, and how do we build to that? We distribute resources, we distribute capital, we distribute all this other stuff. It doesn't mean that we all make the same amount of money. It doesn't mean that we all have the same amount of prospects. The person who owns the capital should make more money than the laborer because he's risking his neck. You're not risking your neck. You're providing the labor. But that doesn't mean that you should get paid pennies. It doesn't mean that you should be completely beholden to the capitalist. It doesn't mean that the disparity should be so large that it's absurd, like it is with Jeff Bezos and with all of his 100,000 workers, like it is with most companies. The way that this works, the society that this has worked the best in was actually a Catholic society that I forget the name of in Spain. And it was started by a priest. And they had their own banks who had your best interest at heart. They had their own medical system. They had their own everything. And people lived in this society within the Spanish government. And they made their own community where they sold, I think he like bought a warehouse or something, and they ended up selling like boats or something like that, or like different like warehouse items. And people can ply their craft. People can build boats. People can build things. People can labor. The laborers are justly compensated for their labor. The capitalist who ultimately makes the capital investment makes more money, but not so much more money that it's absurd. And the banks do take interest on your loans, but only so much as to pay the bankers. Only so much as to keep the bank open. They don't when you default on your credit card payment, they don't jack your loan price up to like 10% and make it impossible for you to pay back your credit card debt for the rest of your life because they have your best interest at heart. They actually care about you. These are your people. These are your Catholic brothers and sisters. So I think that a lot of the principles which are found in here, I don't like the statement. The way that they treat the poor would seem Maoist or Trotskyist. I don't like that statement because it doesn't really tell me a whole lot of information about what principles he's actually talking about. Because I'm sure that even within Maoism and Trotskyism, there are differences too.
There's contradictions as well.
Contradictions. So I'm not 100% certain that I would even begin to agree with that at all. But I think that, like, again, those principles of fighting against sin wherever it exists, as much as you can, as much as is prudent. If you're in China, you probably shouldn't fight against sin as much as someone who is in America, simply because it wouldn't be prudent for you or your loved ones for you to go away. So, as much as is prudent, and then also the principle of the laborer should be justly compensated for his wages, and people who are frugal and people who are trying to be smart with their money and live simply and modestly should not have this sort of overarching, all-encompassing debt to their lives. I think if you act on those principles, I think that you're pretty much on the Catholic path.
Definitely. And I agree with your, based on your description of distributism, I agree with a lot of things there, right? And I'll use this as a transition to my idea of socialism, right? And this is something that me and Gabe have talked about, and I feel like Gabe has a pretty good idea of what my idea of a more ideal society is. Now, we can never reach that ideal, but I think this is the direction where we should move. And I like to describe it briefly for you to hear your take on it. Please. Socratic process, right?
I'm going to be right back.
Find that truth. Yeah, Gabe's heard it all before. So I think that one of the core principles that we should uphold in order to have a better society, concretely, is that those that have power over others should be held responsible to those that they have power over, right? They should be the institutions that are in place should be structured in a way that those that are at the top of those institutions are incentivized to benefit those that are impacted by the decisions of those institutions, right? And it's a very wordy way of saying democracy, right?
Certainly.
That if a bank or a government or a company has power over a certain group of people, we need to structure the incentives of that institution in a way that the decisions made by that institution are utilitarian, right? They benefit the people that are affected by those decisions.
Aren't or are utilitarian?
Are right. They should be utilitarian, right? And right now, I think that, and I'm gonna make some leaps, and I'm into talking in absolute terms here, right? But that's just for the sake of argument, right? The most important institution, the single most important institution in anyone's life is their employer, right? Where they work, that is the institution that determines when you get up in the morning, what you do with your time, when you eat, what you can do, how much you get paid, all of these things, right? How safe you are. Do you wear a helmet? Do you not wear a helmet, right? All of those things and the accumulation of those decisions determine what your life looks like, right? And that's for most people in a society. Now, if you're, trust fund kid, you don't have to worry about that, right? But most people in a society, their lives are determined by their employer, right? And the decisions of their employer have the biggest effect on their lives, right? Now, some might say that the government is the most important institution, but the government isn't one institution. It's a million institutions all put together in one category called the government, right? But the single most important institution, is your employer, right? And as of now, our companies are structured in an extremely undemocratic way, right? The decisions made or the decision makers are incentivized to make decisions that benefit an extremely small portion of the population, the owners, right? In order to be a CEO, in order to maintain that job, you need to make decisions that either benefit a single owner, right, which is extremely undemocratic, or a group of stockholders, right? You got to make sure the stock goes up. You got to make sure those dividends go out on time, right? Do all these things that keep those people happy, right? And that group of people happy, right? And that group of people is smaller than the group of people that are affected by the decisions, the workers, right? So when a Walmart executive makes a decision that we're going to bust unions or we're going to, cut overtime pay, right? That decision affects the millions of people that work for Walmart, and it might negatively affect them, and it only benefits the stockholders of Walmart and the Walton family, right? And so there's a huge disparity between those two groups. And I feel like that is the fundamental reason why America and other capitalist societies are so unjust, right? It is because decisions are made to benefit those that already have so much. And oftentimes the benefit of that group of people comes at the cost of the pain and suffering of the working class, right? And so companies is the biggest place to change that, right? There's a huge disparity. The undemocratic nature is written into the structure of these companies, right? That's the way they function. That's the way they're designed to function. And we accept that as a society, right? Now, there's a million other institutions that are also undemocratic, right? Government is a big one, right? On paper, we're a democracy. We're a republic. Everybody votes for their elected representatives. And on paper, those representatives should, make decisions that benefit their constituents. However, they don't, right? I feel like that's an easy precedent to have, right? When ExxonMobil donates $1 million to the Republican Party or $1 million to the Democratic Party, they are making an investment, right? And they expect to get more than $1 million of benefit.
They're making a business decision.
Right, exactly. They're a for-profit enterprise, and they wouldn't make that decision if they didn't get $1 million more out of that investment, right?
It's not altruistic.
It's not altruistic, right? They don't corporations don't have
They
ideology.
would equally give that money to the Democratic Party if it suited their needs.
Exactly, and they do, right? Plenty of people
Yes.
give money to both, right? Elon Musk, for example, donates money to both parties, right? Equally, right? And that way, anytime there's a bill that threatens his wealth, he can threaten to revoke that donation, whether either party puts it up, right?
Yeah, Elon is just a very smart man.
You call it smart, but he's making that money off of the backs of the people that should be represented by those parties, right? So that's another undemocratic system, right? And as I look across American society, all I see is undemocratic systems, right, that are designed to benefit the people that have so much, and that benefit comes at the cost of the happiness and wealth of the people that don't have anything, right? So to me, socialism doesn't mean the government does everything, and doesn't mean that everything is nationally controlled. It doesn't mean that everybody gets paid the same amount. To me, socialism means a democratic society where every single institution is structured in a way that those that are in power in that institution are incentivized to make decisions that benefit those that are affected, right? And it needs to be quantitative, and it needs to be concrete, right? Every single institution needs to have checks and balances that make sure those in power are making decisions that benefit those that are affected, right? And I brought up, two easy examples, right? Companies and the government, right? But every single institution, right? Water utilities, telecom companies, all of these institutions need to have checks and balances that make sure that people are satisfied with the decisions that their leaders are making, right? I'm sure if you asked all of the people that are serviced by Comcast right now, are you satisfied with the board of directors at Comcast?
Hell no.
Hell no. That's what they would say, right? And as a result, there should be a system in place that says, listen, board of directors at Comcast, you need to make decisions that benefit the people that are affected by your decisions, right? And now, whether that is, profiteering, or whether it is a socialized system, I leave that up to the market, right? And that's another key point in my personal ideology, is that the democracy and the market have to work in conjunction, right? It can't be all democracy. It can't be, fully nationalized companies. There needs to be the market to complement that, right? And we'll go back to the example of companies to illustrate this, right? Is if all companies were magically socialized, they all became co-ops tomorrow, right? A lot of workers and a lot of companies would feel the desire to loot the company, right? That they say, listen, let's just work 2 days a week, right, for 3 hours a day, and give ourselves fat bonuses every day, right? Let's not do anything. That's
company goes under.
The company goes under, right? And that's where the market comes into play, right? Is that if that company isn't profitable and it's not making a profit, it's taking more money than it's producing, banks won't give it loans, it won't be solvent, and it will go under, right?
And the incentives of the worker is directly tied to how much money they make.
Exactly.
So the harder that you work, the more money you make.
Exactly, which means that because right now
they're going to be more efficient,
and you will work in a way.
I mean, that's what you see with the post office and everybody who has pensions off the post office,
right?
And
they do
like
the
U.S.
bare
Postal
minimum.
Service. They do the bare minimum. They
Right.
suck. The U.S. Postal Service has been losing money since they were first created.
Yeah.
And they're continually just being propped up by the government and all these shitty workers. And DMV is the same way. It's like because these people know they have the security that they're not going to work hard. I'm not saying that everybody who works for the DMV sucks or everybody that works for the U.S. the U.S. Postal Service sucks.
Yeah.
But
there is a
that's not
pattern
true.
there.
But there is a pattern.
Definitely.
Right,
Definitely.
and that pattern is seen all across America. If you work for McDonald's, you're going to do the bare minimum not to get fired.
Yeah, you're going to give crappy service because you don't give a crap.
Yeah, I
You
don't
can just
care
still
about
get
the
paid.
success of Ronald McDonald.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And
I don't care about the success of some weird cartoon-looking character.
exactly.
And, whoever the hell's actually in that costume.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Whoever McDonald
exactly.
actually is
And
now.
so by restructuring it to say that, listen, your paycheck and how much money you bring home at the end of the year is directly connected to how good this business is. Now all of a sudden there's a social incentive to be as good as you possibly can, because now all of a sudden you're working as hard as you can, right? That goes without saying. I'm gonna try my ass off. I want to make sure that this McDonald's franchise is the best it possibly can be. But then you look across the the store and you see Gerald, and he's slacking off, and he's wiping tables real slow, and he's clearly high as shit, right?
Yeah.
You now have an incentive to reprimand Gerald. You say, Gerald, listen, all of our paycheck depends on how hard we all work, and you're slacking, man. That affects me at the end of the day, right?
And look at this other guy who just came in and put in a job app wearing a button-down shirt and a
Exactly.
tie, he looks like he's on the money.
Exactly. And now, all of a sudden, all these institutions have an incentive to become more efficient, more profitable, and they have an incentive to become entrepreneurial at every level. Right now, there's no incentive for a McDonald's worker to, tweak some process in the store to make it more efficient, because at the end of the day, they're going to get paid minimum wage no matter what. But now all of a sudden they say, hey, listen, if we, have more of a supply chain working, right, where you just flip the burgers and I put them on the buns, right? And I don't know how a McDonald's franchise works, but they can tweak something, right, to make it more efficient. It'll make them richer at the end of the day, and so they have that incentive.
You see businesses that work this way, the people who they actually employ end up being so much happier in the long run too, because people want to be successful. They want to work their ass off.
Right.
People want these like short-term goals of like, hey, like our neighbor across the street, the company literally incentivized him and said, if you make this amount of money, you will make this percentage you will get a cut of this percentage of how much over our goal you make. That is a big incentive.
Right.
He worked his ass off. He brought that company up like 200% and was supposed to get $1 million check. $1 million. And then they fired him.
Right.
Now, that's an injustice on their part, and that's something that he definitely should have been protected against, and he was legally protected against it.
Yeah.
But it was, like, in the fine print that no one reads and all this other stuff, and, like, it was just a completely shady business practice. But at the end of the day, what they were doing by incentivizing him to go above and beyond, it called him to action.
Definitely.
He benefited, the company benefited, everyone benefited.
And all the customers benefited.
And all the customers benefited,
as a whole
too.
Got more efficient.
Yep.
It's good for all of us.
Yeah.
Right? And I want to take that and extrapolate it across all of society.
And you want that to be put in place legalistically.
Right? Now I think that it's important right here to once again acknowledge the market, right? And one key thing is the question of how much should entrepreneurs get, right? And that's something I'll get into in a bit, right? But I ultimately think that a majority of companies and majority of all institutions should be controlled by the people that they affect, right? Now, does that mean that all companies should be 100% owned by all the workers equally? I don't know. That could be the best system. But I think that at this point...
It is for some companies.
It is for some companies, right? And I think that we should allow experimentation in the market to take its role, right? Let's say California says 70% of all companies are controlled by their workers, right? So now all of a sudden, 70% of all these companies in California are controlled by their workers, right? But then Mississippi, on the other hand, might say, listen, we're going to give them the least possible, 50%, right? 50% is controlled by the workers, the rest is controlled by the entrepreneur. Now, all of a sudden, these companies are engaging in the marketplace, and we will see which system is better, right? And that's where the market comes into play, right? Where we allow these companies to experiment, to reach the best conclusion, and to determine, quantitatively and concretely which is the best system. And the only way to do that is in practice, right? We can sit here in the garage and talk about what's best in theory, but the only way to really find out is by putting these systems into place and seeing what degree of socialism, what degree of cooperativism is really the best, right?
Yeah, well, I can think of one practical step just right off the top of the dome, which is giving workers the ability to unionize again. Because since the 1920s, it's been no unions ever, and all unions are bad. And if we hear you say the word union, you're fired. Like Walmart, I think it's called Yellow Books or something like that, which is basically a legal contract that if you mention the word union ever, we get to fire you instantly with no repercussions. Right? It doesn't matter if you've been working there for 20 years. We can fire you instantly.
Yeah.
And,
wow.
And, and it's also been a part of American history that when we hear the word unions, the American government comes in and puts in Pinkertons, and Pinkertons are basically just undercover agents whose job is to infiltrate unions and basically bust them up. And unions, I think, are actually a pretty good thing because it gives the worker the ability to make a decision with the employer in the first place. I want shorter hours.
It's like a guild in the medieval age.
Yeah, exactly. I want shorter hours. I want to have some say in my paycheck. All these things help benefit the families of America, right? And the majority of the population too, because if you have just Samuel Walton making all your Samuel Walton.
There's like 12 Waltons at this point. Like we're 3 generations down the pipe, and they all have like $30 billion net worth each.
It's insane.
Anyways,
the Waltons.
Yeah, but having some say in the way that the company is run is a good thing. Now,
absolutely,
there's some debate about how to implement all this stuff. I think that's really where I'm a little bit hesitant, is how are we actually going to institute the workers having more power over the company, right? And I think the company is the right place of attack too, because the company is the most important. I mean, you could say the person's job is probably the most important part of their day, right? Just generally, and if you influence the way that they operate in their company, it will ultimately change the family structure as a whole too. And really, it really is sad to see that so much of the wealth in America, got to tread carefully here, so much of the wealth in America is owned by a small few, and the donations that they make are only minuscule to the amount of total wealth that they do have.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately any logical, moral person looking at the American system and America's wealth distribution could say it's unjust, right? Now, there's plenty of people that, are bootlickers and love, kissing the butts of the wealthy and the aristocrats, who would disagree or, put up some barrier to that and say, no, Jeff Bezos earned all that money, right? And no, Elon Musk deserves to be a billionaire and rule over his employees, right? But I think that it is, inherently a bad system, right? Because allowing this system to exist is not meritocratic in a pure way, right? It has some meritocracy attached to it, right? You can't become a billionaire purely by having billions, right? Although it is true, right? If you're born into a lot of money, you can just put it into
money
an
makes more
investment
money,
account,
right?
But I think that, ultimately, this current system hurts a majority of the people and benefits a minority of the people, right? Which is unutilitarian at its core, right? And so it is in the best interest of the American people as a whole to change the system and make it more utilitarian, right?
Definitely. And you want everyone to be adequately provided.
Right, exactly. And I think that now, my form of socialism doesn't necessarily provide that, the necessities of life, right? You need to be employed, right? You need to contribute. And that's where I believe in a relatively strong welfare state, that there is a safety net to catch you when you fall, right? And if you get homeless, you don't have to worry about starving to death, right? We have an apartment for you somewhere, right? And, if you aren't able to feed your family, you get laid off, right? You don't have to worry about that, right? You get food stamps, right? The base necessities of your life are guaranteed.
Your basic welfare.
Is provided for you, right?
Well, and especially now, because we just dumped $2.3 trillion into the economy,
right?
And so now we're seeing a very big shift in the way that government and welfare can be provided,
right?
The majority of the 2.3 didn't go to the general population.
Yeah,
it went to like Carnival,
right,
which is a cruise liner.
Big companies,
and with no limitations either. It's not you have to put this money and give it to your workers for labor.
Yeah.
No, that wasn't they didn't put that on the contract.
Yeah.
They said this is executive. We give you the executive this money and you choose to do what you want with this money.
I mean, tons of people have been laid off by their companies anyways, and the only money that they're getting at all is not from the company that used to employ them.
1,200 Trump bucks, man.
Yeah, it's 1,200 Trump bucks because they're getting their Trump bucks because they're completely unemployed and they got the stimulus package that came to these companies, and it's like, oh, that'll stimulate the economy. People are going to be much better off because of this. How many people are unemployed right now? How many people are sitting on that $1,200?
Like 25 million,
They need
right?
way more than that to actually survive well, like properly.
Yeah.
It's like that doesn't seem just.
Yeah, it's crazy. But I want to sort of illustrate for you, Paul, some of the kinks in my problem, right? Some of the gaps in my idea of socialism, right?
Yeah.
Because on face value, it doesn't seem like you have any glaring, questions or
I don't have any glaring issues with this, but
Right.
I think that if I had one thing to say before you point out these holes is that I think that the number one most important institution in a person's life is their job, but I think that it should be their religion.
That's right. Yeah.
I think that the number one important institution in their life should be their religion, because their religion, the way that people worship affects not just how they live their day-to-day life, but also how they think, how they speak, how they act. It affects everything. I think that how people worship I think that people's moral principles are the number one most important like it affects the most in their life. It affects what kind of job you will take. You know, if you are a Catholic, you best not go become an abortionist doctor, else you will be quickly and swiftly removed from the body of Christ. You'll be removed from the Catholic Church. So, or you should be at least. Anyways, but I think in people's day-to-day lives, especially people who are irreligious, and many people who are religious, unfortunately, even many good Catholics, actually consider their job to be even more important in their life than religion, but it ought not be that way. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But I think it is. But anyways, so now we can point out the holes now that I just
Can
put in
I
that
point
one
out a
interjection.
hole that I see?
Go ahead.
So there's an assumption that the marketplace acts in a way that is adequate to the efficiency of the company, right? So if a company's more efficient, then the marketplace will ultimately choose that company. Well, there's many cases where a company that is inefficient still is extremely profitable, right? So the assumption that the workers will work harder, therefore they'll make more money, isn't necessarily true, because they can be working harder and make less money. So, for example, let's say a Blockbuster, let's say Blockbuster's still around. There's an employee who decides the system is in place where the harder they work, the more money they make. Well, Blockbuster's going to go out of business despite his efficiency in his work, because Netflix is coming around. So how do you compensate competition that drives other businesses out of business, and how the efficiency of the worker will ultimately increase their pay?
Yeah, well, I think that once again, we have to leave some of this up to the market, right? We can, some companies might choose to adopt the model that all profits go to the workers, right? At the end of the month, everything that we have left over just gets distributed equally, right? Some of them might choose that, we distribute all the paychecks, but it's not equal, right? Managers get paid a little bit more. If you're, it's your first month here, you get paid a little bit less, right? But they can choose to distribute all the profits. Now, some other companies might choose to have wages, right? Say that, you get paid X amount of dollars, right? And at the end of the year, we can decide how much do we want to keep in the bank for future investments? How much do we want to put into the company? How much do we want to give out in bonuses? I don't know. And I'm never going to claim to know the best system, right? But it's up to the workers themselves and the market to decide which is the best system, right? Some workers might choose distributing all the profits equally at the end of the month. Others might choose that, listen, we're just going to take wages and at the end of the year, we get bonuses, but we put aside a bunch of the money that we make to invest back into the company, get new machines, better machines, hire more workers, expand, right? And at the end of the day, the market is going to decide which of those systems is the best, right? And you bring up a good point. What happens to all the workers at Blockbuster when they are just stuck on a sinking ship, right? They're doomed, right? No matter how hard they work, they're going to end up working at a unprofitable company. They're going to get driven out of business by Netflix, right? And that's where the welfare state comes in, right? Is that even if you are stuck,
it's the lifeboat.
If you're stuck on a sinking ship, at the end of the day, you're going to have food on your table. You're going to have a roof above your head. And no matter what, you're not going to suffer the unjust suffering of having nothing in our society, right? No matter what, company you work at, and even if you get fired, you're still going to be able to pay for your cancer treatment, right? Because we provide that, right? Universal healthcare, that's provided for you. No matter how poor you are, and no matter how badly your company's doing, the base necessities of life are provided for you, right?
Yeah, you're not going to die because you're poor.
Exactly, you're not going to die because you're poor or because your managers made bad decisions, right? That's a key thing, absolutely. Right? Right, and it's not a perfect system. Obviously, there are going to be holes in that system, and there's going to be people that suffer. But we should fight to uphold a welfare state that provides the necessities for people that need it, while allowing the market to cleanse the marketplace and reward efficient companies and punish inefficient companies.
Yeah,
which drives them towards efficiency, right? And I don't think that bad managers should be forced to be homeless and not have food. Of course not. That's why the welfare state's there. But we should constantly push our companies and our institutions to better themselves and to become more efficient, because it doesn't just benefit them, it benefits all of us, right? And so I'll bring up one specific thing that I've seen as a whole in this system, right? And that's how to reward capital and how to reward entrepreneurial labor, right?
Yeah.
So I'll start by comparing the current system to this hypothetical, right? Under the current system, labor is given to a company in exchange for a set wage, right? And that's a majority of majority of jobs. Right now, there are jobs that are commission based. Right, as a salesman, you get you get paid based on how much you sell.
Yeah, if you're a car salesman, if you sell 10 cars, you get paid more.
Exactly. So
being a waiter or waitress is kind of that way.
Yeah, you get tips, right? But a majority of jobs, you get a set amount of money for a set amount of hours, right? And that's determined before you sign up for the job. You know how much you're going to get paid.
Either by salary or by hourly wage.
Exactly. You know what's going to go on, right? You might move up in the company, but at the end of the day, it's set. It's capped, right? For a majority of jobs, right? Yeah. However, on the flip side of that, the other ingredient that is necessary to make a company and to make goods and services is capital. Capital's rewards are not capped, right? The owners of the company, if let's say, this company finds a really good market niche and makes a ton of money, right? The workers are going to get paid the set amount, no matter if they make, 1,000% above return,
Apple,
or 1,000,000% above return, right?
Yep.
At the end of the day, they're going to get paid their wage, or they're going to get paid their salary. On the other hand, the owners, the stockholders, right, the people that provided capital to this company, can get paid a potentially infinite amount of money, right? They can get paid as much as they possibly can desire, right? And they might choose to get it in dividends. They might just choose to let the stock go up and have their assets increase in value. But at the end of the day, their share of the money is infinite and it's not capped. And on the other hand, labor's share of that money is capped and it is finite, right? And I think that under this system, it would be reversed, right? That labor's share of the money is potentially infinite. Now, it's up for the market and the workers themselves to decide if it is infinite or not, the same way stockholders decide whether they get paid out in dividends every single year or they just let the stock increase in value, right? It's up to the workers themselves to decide, do we get all the profits ourselves, or do we allow it to sit in the company and make the company more profitable? And on the flip side, capital would be rewarded at a fixed rate, right? It would be rewarded with an interest rate, right? And that's the way you reward capital in many ways right now, right? But I think that is a concrete, effective system for getting capital for an investment and rewarding that capitalist, right, for the use of that capital while not encroaching on the potential benefit for the majority, right, the workers, right? So let's make it a little bit more concrete, right? Mm-hmm. So if all companies, all startups now adopt this system of, in order to reward capital, we can offer them a concrete set interest rate, then there will now be a market for those interest rates, right? Riskier companies are going to have to offer higher interest rates, right? And established companies, everyone knows that Walmart's going to continue to make money, is going to have to, they're going to offer a lower interest rate because people are much more willing to give out that loan, right? So now all of a sudden, the market for labor the current market for labor looks like the future market for capital, right? That all these capitalists with all these piles of money are looking for the best interest rate, the best amount of bang for their buck, and then they compare that to the risk, right? They say, listen, this startup that's going to make, glitter covered headbands is offering a lot of interest on this loan, right? But it's risky. Who knows if glittered headbands is going to make money or not, right? And I compare that to, this railroad. Everyone knows this railroad is going to make money. Railroads make money in the past. They're just going to build a new stretch of railroad, but they're offering a lower interest rate. So now all of a sudden, there's the same market for capital investment there is for labor investment now. But the thing is that those capital investments are capped. They don't have infinite returns, and they're not able to reap all the benefit of that institution, right? So there would still be capital investment in these companies. The only difference would be that they would be competing for a fixed rate, the fixed interest rate on that loan, and there would still be a market for that interest rate, but it would be capped. Does that make sense?
Do you think? Yeah, it does. Do you think that a better solution would be, or do you not necessarily better, but do you think a solution might be to have a percentage that capitalists can make? So like if you invest a certain percent of capital, you should be allowed to make 40% of that capital plus the capital that you make back. So 140%. So if you invest $100,000 into this enterprise and let's say it makes $200,000, well, instead of keeping, let's just make it more simple. So I have workers who work for me who make $10 an hour, and let's say that the total cost of labor plus the cost of my business plus the cost of overhead plus the cost of goods plus the cost of everything. Let's say that per month I have to spend $100,000 to keep my business flowing and to keep money going to my workers without keeping a single cent for myself. Now let's say that I put in that $100,000 and that's my investment, and at the end of the month I make back $1 million. So I can put $100,000 into my business the next month, and I know that it's going to churn out. I know that it's going to keep going. I don't know if it's going to make $1 million the next month or whatever. These things go up and down, but let's say for the month I make $1 million. Now I get to keep 900,000 of that if I want to put 100,000 back into my business. Now let's say I want to buy even more goods, so I can try to make even more money, and I want to hire even more people. So now the next month I spend twice as much money on materials, on my space, on et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So bought some trucks.
Bought some trucks.
Yeah.
I hired some workers.
Yeah.
So now my cost is at 200,000. So I get to keep 800,000. So let me just ask you this.
Yeah.
Do you think that is fair? That the person who says, I am going to keep 800,000 of this $1 million that I made, and I'm going to put 200,000 to pay my workers who signed a contract, who agreed to this price, who are happy that they continue to have a job, and all this other stuff, even though obviously everyone wants to make more money. And I think that there's definitely a lot of unjust wage earning that goes on. I think labor is not justly compensated in every situation.
Yeah.
But do you think that it's unfair or unjust for the owner of that company to say, I'm going to keep this 800,000, or do you think it should be mandated by law? Because the only way to enforce these things, unless they're self-imposed, is to be enforced by law.
Yeah, of
whether
course.
or not it's by law from the government or by law inbred in the company.
Yeah, yeah.
So do you think that that is
that
what do you think the solution is?
Right.
To that?
So what you've done here is you've merged the roles of capitalist and entrepreneur, right? And what I was talking about previously was specifically the role of capitalist, right?
Okay.
So someone that just gives money, right? A banker or a bank that loans money, right? Or a private investor that gives money but has no work in the day-to-day activities of the company, right? Now, in your hypothetical, you're the owner, right? You're the CEO, you're at the top of this company, and you're making decisions, right? You're working for this company, and you're contributing your entrepreneurial labor into this company, right? And as of now, those two roles are constantly interconnected, right? That oftentimes the entrepreneur is the capitalist, right? And oftentimes the capitalist is the entrepreneur, right? Because it's almost impossible to be an entrepreneur without money, right? You need to have money.
You have to be a capitalist to some degree.
To some degree.
Maybe
right?
you're not the sole contributor of capital to the company, but you are at least a contributor to the capital.
But even if you get a full investment and someone buys the company off your hands, you still need to be able to sustain yourself for a certain amount of time without working in order to establish that company to be bought.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So even that requires some amount of money in the bank. So
For sure.
so the role of entrepreneur and capitalist right now are tied together. Right. But I think that those roles should be separated. Right. Which would meritocratize the entrepreneurial market, right? So right now, all entrepreneurs are people that have money, right? If you have no money at all, you're not going to be able to be an entrepreneur, right?
Right.
And so by broadening the amount of people that are entrepreneurs, right, and taking down the barriers that stop people from being entrepreneurs, you automatically get a better crop of entrepreneurs, right? Because if you're only taking the best of the 2% of the population that are able to do it, you're going to get worse results than if you take the best of 100% of the population that have these ideas and have the capability to implement them and make goods and services, right? And the way we do that is by creating entrepreneurial type institutions, right? Now, these would be venture capital-esque firms that would sometimes employ entrepreneurs, sometimes just reward them for their entrepreneurial labor. So let's say you have a great idea for a company, right? You say, listen, we're going to make mittens that just allow these two fingers to stick out, right? The pointer finger and the thumb, so that someone can use the thumb for, the pointer finger for extra stuff. It's a great idea. Everyone's going to love these mittens, right? But you have no money, right? You work at 7-Eleven. Now, you might have some experience. You have a good business mind. You have a good business acumen. You've got an entrepreneurial mind, right? But you don't have the capital necessary to start this thing up. And you have no connections, right? You don't have an uncle that's a billionaire. You're not the member of a country club. You have no way of accessing the money necessary to, get this company started up, right? So in this hypothetical, you
go to Shark Tank.
You go to Shark Tank, essentially. But it would be an institution, right, that lends money, right, to these entrepreneurs at a fixed interest rate, right? And now all of a sudden there would be a market for entrepreneurial activity, right? If you're a first-time entrepreneur, right, you've never ever made a company before, you're 22, you're pimply faced, right? The person at this institution is going to say, all right, listen, if you make this thing happen, we'll reward you with, 1% of our loan, right? We'll give you 1% of the interest rate that we get off of this money, right?
Right.
Now you might say that's not good enough. So you go to another one, right? You go to the other entrepreneurial institution, right? You say, how much are you going to give me? We'll give you 2%. And we'll give you more money, right? We think this is a great idea, right? And then you go and take that money and you go and make this mitten company, right? Now you're making this mitten company and become successful, right? In a year, right? And so you've taken this startup capital and you've made a successful company with it. You've bought, the resources and you've bought the labor along with the capital necessary to make a good and service, right? Now how you should be rewarded for that entrepreneurial labor is up to the market. Right? Now, some companies might offer you, say, listen, you'll just get 3% of that company and the profits for the rest of the company's lifetime, you'll get 3%, right? Now, other companies might just say that, all right, we'll give you a percentage of the interest rate of the loan that we make initially, right? And now, another thing to consider is that if you continue to work for that company, you'll get paid, right? If you're operating as a CEO, you will get paid a wage or a salary, right? So now all of a sudden, you're not operating in an entrepreneurial context, you're just being a manager, right? And you'll get rewarded for that managerial labor that you're putting into the company. Now, you need to make sure that the workers feel like you're being a good manager, right? Because ultimately they're the ones that are electing you to that position. So you got to make sure that they're happy, right? That means you can't just fire everybody and move the company to Mexico. That means you can't, treat them like shit. You got to give them, safety protection, right? And, give them good healthcare plans. But ultimately, you are being rewarded for being a good manager, right? And so ultimately, I don't have a concrete, exact, precise way to reward entrepreneurs, right? But I think that we should set up a system that allows for these entrepreneurial venture capital type institutions to compete for rewarding entrepreneurs. They're going to naturally compete for the best entrepreneurs, right? Now, Mark Cuban type is going to get rewarded greatly because these institutions know that he produces results, right? And we're going to have to reward him more to get his business and to get him to, use our money to start up this company, right? But then once this company is established, entrepreneurial labor will be separated from managerial labor. And if you're continuing to operate as a manager, you're going to get rewarded as a manager, right? But if you want to be a serial entrepreneur, then you leave that company alone. You say, I set it up. It's successful. It's looking good. I'm going to continue to rake in 3% off of the interest rate made with the initial startup capital. And you might have signed a deal that says, I'll get 3% of any other interest rate for the lifetime of this company. Maybe not. I don't know. It's up to the market, right? But if you want to be a serial entrepreneur, you can say, all right, I'm done with this company. I'm making passive income from it, and I'm going to go back to being an entrepreneur. That's what I do best, right? So I'm going to go back. I got another idea. I'm going to go back to another entrepreneurial institution, make that new company, and just keep on cranking out these companies.
Or maybe you even have enough capital now to be your own investor.
Right, exactly. But I think that if you're your own investor, right, that it still should be fixed, right? That as you sign up with this company, right, you're making this company, it should be written to the company's constitution, quote unquote, the amount of money that you're able to receive off of it, right? That you're only able to receive, a fixed interest rate off of the initial loan.
So
right?
I think that instead of maybe a price cap, there should be a percentage cap, because I can foresee problems with, for example, if you want to say that Bill Gates should make less, if you want to say Bill Gates should make less money, I would agree with you. I don't think anybody should have as much capital as Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or anybody else like that does. I think that the money in those, I don't want to call them like dirty capitalist pigs or anything. I don't think they are, but I definitely think that their workers are not justly compensated, especially a company like Apple, where you know that in China they're making very, very meager wages to do their very meager jobs that are going to eventually be replaced by robots anyways. But that being said, I don't think that there should be this hard and fast cap on a price. Like, I'm the CEO of this company. I put in this amount of capital. Okay, so you're trying to say that those are two different things. So and I agree. Like, there's the CEO of a company, and then there's the capital that comes from the capitalist.
Right.
And then you say that there should be a cap on the
entrepreneur,
capital.
right?
And then there's also the entrepreneur.
Entrepreneur is the person that brings in the capital, the resources, and the labor to make the good and service.
To make the good, right.
Right. So that would be
brings it all together.
Jeff Bezos, right? Or your dad, right? He's the one that took
brings
time
it all together.
to bring it all together. And then there's the CEO, the manager, right? Once those factors of production are all brought together, that continues to manage those, right? Makes day-to-day decisions, right? And continues to make sure that this is a profitable institution, right?
Right.
And there's also the capitalist, right? Those are three different roles that often is embodied by one person, right? But I think that each of those roles should be rewarded separately.
Okay,
right?
so you think that if you are a CEO, that you should make a certain amount of money, you should have a salary to be a CEO.
I don't know that. Like, I'm never going to say that CEOs should make 20% of the company, right? I'll leave that up to the market.
Got it, okay.
If a company wants a good CEO, they're going to have to reward them, right?
Right.
And you can't just pay the CEO the same amount as a janitor and expect to get the best CEO in the country, right? That's just not going to happen. That's not the way the labor market works.
Of course, yeah.
But then again, if the CEO isn't pulling his weight or in their weight, right? Then they're not going to be rewarded, right? So if a CEO is demanding to be paid $6 million a year, right? And all the other workers are getting, $100,000 a year, and the workers don't feel like they're worth $6 million a year, they'll go to the labor market and they'll find someone else that is willing to take $2 million a year and do just as good, if not better, a job. Right.
Got it.
So
Okay.
I think
Okay.
that, that should be up to the labor market.
That should be up to the labor market.
Right.
So you're saying, but the problem is now that the workers in the company don't have that power.
And not only that, the executive board are the ones that make decisions about wages. They're the ones that say, how much should we get paid? How much should we pay them? Right. So they, naturally inflate their own worth. They say that I'm worth $1 million a year, of course, right? But the thing is, managerial labor is incredibly hard to price, right? You're able to price wage labor, right? You say that this person works on the supply line, they make X amount of gadgets a day, those gadgets sell for Y amount of money, right? So clearly you're able to see how much that person contributes in a day, right? But how much is good managing worth, right? How much is good decision making worth, right? It's incredibly hard to price, right?
Right.
And because there's sort of a gray area there, CEOs and board of directors will naturally choose the highest possible price. They say, well, of course my decision making is worth $100,000 a year, right? Of course it's worth $6 million a year, because that's the highest amount they can demand. And because CEOs all across the country are demanding the highest possible amount, it artificially inflates the price of high-level managerial labor, right? Because, well, listen, Pizza Hut is paying their, CEO, $8 million a year. We're Domino's. How else are we going to get a good CEO but then by, paying him $9 million a year, right? So there's naturally an artificial inflation of the price of high-level managerial labor that does not accurately reflect the actual value put into those companies, right? Now, if you shift the power in those companies from owners, right, and people that are a part of the class of that high-level managerial class, and shift the power to the workers, there will naturally be a decrease in the value and the reward for high-level managerial labor, right? I doubt if you ask any janitor or any cashier at Walmart, hey, should the Waltons be paid, $100 million a year to be the CFO of this company, they will naturally say, no, they should be paid less, right? Now, if it goes too far, right, and workers say, we're going to pay them the same amount as us, right? They're just working the same amount as us. They also work 12-hour days. Then that CEO will leave the company, right, and find a better paying job because the market will accommodate for that high skilled labor. And they're going to have to find someone that is willing to take $30,000 a year for a CEO job. And that labor is going to be worth less, and it's going to be less valuable, and that company is going to go under.
Yeah, so what
right?
is the equal protection for the CEO who comes into a company and is like, I have a cap at $2 million, so no, I'm not even that incentivized to make a lot more money?
Well, at the end of the day, they're still a worker, right?
Right.
And I mean, obvious, like there's no one way that socialist companies and co-ops should be set up, right?
Yeah.
But if it's set up as a profit-sharing company, and if the workers want to reward their managers in a way to get themselves the best managers, they will give managers a higher percentage of the profits, right? They say that, listen, upper management, if they do a really good job of managing this company, they can get 20% of the profits this year, right? The rest of us will take 80, even though they're just 1% of the workers, right? And if they want to have the best managers possible, they will make that sort of decision. And the companies that make the wrong decision on that front will have worse managers and will
So the
do
people
worse
that
in
are
the
like,
marketplace.
we want the CFO to have 10% and us to have 90 of the profits for the year.
Yeah.
And then the CFO's like, I'm not taking 10%. I'm the CFO. I'm taking 30%.
Yeah.
He just has that.
He has the power.
He has that power.
Well, not necessarily, because there is democracy involved, right? At the end of the day, the power stems from the workforce as a whole, right? So it's like if your senator said, I don't know, I'm going to cut the minimum wage to 0 in this county, right? Now, senators don't have the power to do that, but I'm using that as an example because they are an elected representative,
Right. Yep.
right? If that pisses off most of the people in that constituency, they will get voted out, right? The same way, if a CFO makes a greedy decision and the workers of that company see that decision and say, that's not in our best interest, that's not in the best interest of the company, that CFO is being greedy, we're going to vote him out, next election, right? Whenever that is, whenever the companies want to have them, right? Because they are tied to the will of the workers, the will of the majority, they need to please that majority in order to retain their position of power in the company, right?
Right.
Yeah, really what I see this whole debate is trying to defend against is how the wealthy can't have any more material happiness, right? And they've already reached a cap. So we'll say the cap is maybe $8 million. Once you have $8 million, you can satisfy all your material needs, per se. And for anyone to have more than $8 million is a surplus of wealth. And what should instead happen is that surplus that they have should be redistributed to people who are actually laboring, right? That's what you're really talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, to some extent, yes. I think that the disparity of wealth in this country is immoral and it's unjust, right? But ultimately, I think that the amount of wealth you have should be tied to the value of your labor.
But it's like you said, very hard to determine how much wages they should be paid according to their labor.
Right, but we can still determine it, right? Michael Jordan got paid a lot of money for playing basketball. He was a really good basketball player. And I think he should get paid that amount of money because the market, the NBA, determined that that's the amount of money he should be paid for the labor of shooting hoops, right? And I think that should be extrapolated all across society, right? That if you are a really good CEO and you just kill it at managing companies, you should get rewarded a lot. You should get paid a lot of money.
I feel like that's already how it happens, though. Like, I feel like
but
you
now
know what I mean?
now we bring in the reward of capital, right? Let's say you're Walton, right? And I know I love to bring up the Waltons, but to me
They're a very easy example.
easy example. It's easy to shit on the Waltons, So you're a third generation Walton. You're not Samuel Walton. You're not the person that crafted the Walton Empire. You're just born into this family, right? And you are born with $20 billion in a bank account, right? Now you're able to take that $20 billion and make investments with it, right? And you buy up this shipping company, and you buy up this clothing company, and you buy up all these other things. You buy stocks, you make good investments, right? Now all of a sudden you're able to double your wealth while doing no labor at all, right?
But you're still making those business decisions and risking the capital that you have that could fail.
Right, but to me, rewarding those that already have capital. Now, do I think they should be rewarded? Yes, right, to some extent. Right? How else are you going to get capital in the first place for the investments?
Yeah, otherwise people are never going to make investments. If there's no reward to be had, then there's no investors that are going to actually put money into that market.
Right, but I think that the infinite reward to capital, right, which is what owners get, a potentially infinite reward for that capital, exacerbates the wealth divide that we have in this country, right? And I think that should there be a wealth divide? Yes, because people's labor is valued different. But I think that ultimately we should make sure that your wealth is derived from the value of your labor, right? If you're born into a wealthy family, that doesn't mean that you're able to become infinitely more wealthy just because you have money. I think that's unjust. And when you have a dollar that you didn't work for, someone else worked for it and you didn't, right? Which is legal theft, right?
Right.
And now we justify it. We say, well, that's how it works. We have to let it work that way. I think that we can structure our society in a way to not infinitely reward those that have money, right? When we do that with banks now, right? We pool all of our money together. That financial institution makes those right financial decisions, and the reward is split up depending on how much money you have in the bank, right? And so the job of making good financial decisions that is made by Walton or is made by a banker at Wells Fargo, it's essentially the same role, right? But we reward one with a wage, right? The person that makes good decisions at Wells Fargo makes a salary, right? Depending on how good they are, right? And the Walton that invests their own personal money gets paid all of the rewards for that money, right? So I think that even that role of making good financial decisions should be rewarded the same way any other labor is rewarded, right? Which is with a wage or a salary determined by the market, right? So I think that we connect.
But the problem gets, it gets to a problem when you say that it's an investment of his own personal money, because I see that bankers who are pushing around money, who are making investments, who are trying to keep banks afloat and profitable and put money into their own pockets as well, and secure the money that gets entrusted to them. They should receive a salary. That makes sense to me because they're working a salary type job. They are working with someone else's money, and ultimately they're not risking their own neck short of doing such a terrible job that they get fired. But someone who, like the Walton family, let's say you're a Walton and you want to make $100 million investment into a company that could potentially fail. But yet you could have potential infinite reward, you're right. But you could also have potentially 100% loss, which is you could just have your money, which is truly their money in this legalistic society. Now, that's a whole nother debate about what it means to actually be like your money and what right do you have to money that is superfluous. And actually, if you look in like the traditional Catholic view, especially with distributism, they say that you do not have a right to that which is superfluous to your existence. So like if you, and it doesn't mean that you have to be a beggar. It doesn't mean that like you have to have the bare minimum to survive. You can still have opulence, you can still have wealth, but you shouldn't have so much more that it hinders the ability of someone else to live decently. So if you are living in excess and someone else is living in deficiency, then you do not have a right to the money that you have, which is in excess. It belongs to them, actually, by right.
Yeah. There's a passage that basically says if you have two coats, give one to the poor.
Right. So that is kind of the role of that. But going back to the whole capital thing, they're investing their own personal money into it, right? And they have their own personal money to potentially lose.
Yeah.
But I think that I still agree with you that there should be a cap. But I don't know if that should be a salary that's agreed upon by the laborers. So the people who work at Walmart, or let's just say a union of Walmart workers comes together and they vote and they say the Walton family who invests his money in this business, who pushes around the capital of this business, who makes good business decisions, who truly does make good business decisions. The Walton family did make good business decisions. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the most successful company in the world.
Right.
They deserve to make $200,000 a year. Well, anyone looking in on the situation would say that seems absurd because that is a fraction of a percent of the money that they are actually risking. That is a fraction of 1% of the money that they are actually risking each time that they make a business investment.
Right.
So that would seem absurd. So it's like, okay, so what would be so they should make, let's just say the workers get together and they say that the person who makes the initial investment should get 20%. And then the Waltons are like, okay, I agree with that. What right does the worker have over the person who, even the family who made the company, who made it what it was, who provided them for the job, who risk their livelihood, who risk their own personal investments into this company, and could have potentially lost it all.
Yeah.
But they have to stand to gain. They stand to gain as much as they have gained, which is billions upon billions of dollars.
Right. So there's two parts to my response here, right? Is that the Walton family didn't build Walmart, right? They were a family that helped build Walmart, but if you look at the total number of hours of labor that were put into the institution we call Walmart, their labor represents a tiny, tiny fraction, right?
Yeah,
so
but the risk.
So
but
wait, let me finish, right?
Yeah.
So Sally and Jim and Bob and Robert, they all built Walmart too, right? They swiped groceries, they stocked the shelves. They are just as important to Walmart as the Walton family. Now, we don't know their names, right? I just made up those names. And so it's hard to say that this family is just as responsible and this family should deserve as much credit as the Walton family, right? But I think that saying that without the workers, they're not able to do anything, right?
Right, of course.
So in some ways, the workers deserve all the credit, right? Because without them, the Waltons couldn't have done anything. The Waltons can't, stock all the shelves. The Waltons can't be cashiers for every single, little stall,
They can't
right?
manufacture every good. They can't grow every product. They can't do any of
that.
They
can't do any of that, right? So their labor represents a tiny, tiny portion of the labor put into Walmart, right?
Right.
But then comes the issue of risk, right? And that when you invest your personal money into an institution, you are risking losing all of that money, right? And that issue is something that led to the creation of the first stock market, right? So I'm going to take you guys back to Holland, right, in the 18th century, right? So these wealthy investors would make investments into ships, right, and shipping routes, right? They would go from the Netherlands to Indonesia, pick up spices and bring them back to Europe and make a ton of money, right? And 9 out of 10 times, these ships would make it all the way there, make it all the way back, no problem at all. Everybody makes a ton of money, right? But the issue was that 1 out of 10 of these ships would go under, right? They would get raided by pirates. They would get stuck in a storm. They would crash, right? And then that person would lose their investment, right? And that was a big problem for these Dutch investors because they'd say, listen, there's a 90% chance I make 3 times my initial investment. That's a lot of money, right? But there's a 10% chance that I lose all of my money, right? So what they developed was a system of sharing that risk. So instead of investing all of your money into one ship and one trip, right, they would split it. So you would invest all of your money into 10% of 10 different ships, right? And then if one of those ships went down,
you still are at a net positive.
You would lose 10% of your money, but at the end of the day, you still made money. And all 10 of those investors are safer because they divided their investment, right? And
so really the only way that they can stop making money as a whole is if the value of their goods goes down.
Right. Or all 10 ships sink.
All 10 ships sink,
right?
Which is
nearly
not
impossible,
likely.
Right? And so we do this today, right? We still have stock markets. And that's essentially what banks do, right? Is that all the people in America and the world that bank at Wells Fargo pool their money, right? And we trust that the bankers at Wells Fargo will make good investments with that money. And of course, some of those investments will default, right? Some of those investments will fall through. And, the fracking company in Nebraska will stop being able to sell oil profitably, right?
Right. Yeah. Or even small businesses
even
that they
small
give
businesses.
loans to might default and et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
Happens hundreds of times.
Exactly.
Sure, but our
probably
money is
a
still
month.
guaranteed by the government too, right?
In a way, right? But just talking about the function of banks, right? So we are able to avert the risk of losing your investment by pooling our investments in these financial institutions, right? So we can still have all the wealth in America, but instead of investing in it as individuals, investing in investments as individuals, if we invest in them as institutions, right, we're able to avert the risk of losing all of that money, right? Now, there's less to gain, right? If you make one really good investment yourself and you risk losing all that money, you're going to get way more out of it. You're going to reap all the benefit from that investment, right? But that is something that I'm against in this hypothetical situation, is reaping all of the benefit from an institution created by a lot more people outside of yourself, right? So we can still have investments into necessary institutions, right? Startups are necessary, right? Existing companies are necessary. So we can still provide those investments through these financial institutions while averting the risk of losing all of your money, right? So now all of a sudden, if you stop individuals from investing in these things and making incredible profits or losing a bunch of money, you're still able to have that investment while not stepping on the sovereignty of the workers that work at those companies.
That seems ultimately ideal.
And I mean, there's plenty of problems with it.
Sure. Yeah.
Right? How
There's
are we
definitely
ever,
different. There's tons of problems to solve, but I
Yeah.
mean they're not unsolvable. But I think if you act upon that basis of capital should not be infinitely rewarded, there should be a more democratic way of going about this stuff. We should allow the market to determine what a CEO should make, and not the board of directors, and who are acting under their own self-interest and greed, and not the self-interest of the company and the laborers, and ultimately democratizing. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Democratizing the
labor.
the labor in the company more. I think those are all very admirable, honorable, and good goals to have.
Yeah.
Specifically for the ultimate purpose of the people who work at the companies.
And,
Right,
and
which is
yeah,
basically-
who are we talking about?
Which is
We're
like
talking about the
99%
majority.
of people.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
we're talking about
vast
the majority of the
people.
population.
Right.
I mean, really the people who have extravagant wealth are significantly small.
Right.
Like very, very small.
It's also incredibly difficult. Like for me in my personal situation, I'm 20 years old. I don't have a degree yet, but I'm going to soon. And I am looking to get married in the near future and looking to have a house and looking to have, a steady paying job, et cetera, et cetera. For me to even begin to make enough money to have my own place, just to have my own house, something which used to be in the olden days expected of a man who was only even 17 or 18.
Right. As long as you have a high school diploma, you
As
can have
long-
2 cars and a house, right?
Yeah, I mean, like
good.
even if you talk about like even going like way back in the day, it was. I mean, it hasn't really been this way in America ever. It was a lot more this way back in the day. But if you look at back like in the medieval era, when you became a man, when you were fairly young, like 14, you became a man basically, or like 16. You were expected to be an apprentice. You were expected to work. You were expected to do all that kind of stuff. And if you were a carpenter, you could maybe even build your own home and all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, you were provided the means necessary to have your own home, to have your own means of survival, to have your own, to basically have the foundation necessary for a family. And that was provided to you by the society that you lived in if you were willing to work, right? If you were willing to work, that would be provided for you. In today's climate, today, there are tons of people who have even college degrees, even masters, even PhDs have a lot of difficulty finding jobs in particular fields, specifically like in the liberal arts. I know that my philosophy professor said that he applied, I think he said that like 80% of philosophy PhDs that apply for positions in universities get rejected because people have tenure, they have, they can stay at a university for their whole life, and there's just not a super high demand for philosophy professors. So, and I don't want to make too many broad sweeping statements about how our society sucks and whatever else, but I'm just saying that it is really, really odd and really strange that the interest of the vast majority of people who are basically in my shoes at some point gonna, I try to make as much money as I can, but I'm getting educated right now so that I can make even more money in the future, provide a steady income for myself and possibly a spouse and children. Like that's most people. That's most people, and are willing to work and make a certain amount of and put in effort to make a certain amount of money. The fact that is so underprotected, the fact that is so difficult, genuinely difficult, just seems really backwards and weird.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like 70 years ago, you could go to college for like a dime and a nickel.
Yeah.
It wasn't near.
Now
as
you have to spend an
expensive.
arm and a leg, and not only that, but you have to spend an arm and a leg over the next 20 years.
Exactly. Yeah, I know friends' parents who are still in college debt.
Yeah.
Things are more expensive.
I know people who just got married. They're like 25 or 26 that live with the wife's parents and have 2 kids because their debt that they are still paying off as 26-year-olds. I know that that's not so far after you graduate from college, but they're paying so much money in debt that they both work, but they still have so much debt that they pay off on their loans that they're not even able to make the initial investment into a home for themselves.
Yeah.
That's how difficult it is in today's
and
climate
I
to
think
actually
that
be on your own.
And the narrative is, if they only worked harder.
Yeah, but that's just bullshit.
Yeah,
It's
like,
not true.
You can work harder and you can provide for yourself. Well, in many cases you can. And, now everyone I should say everyone, but a lot of people have college degrees. So a college degree is becoming kind of superfluous, right? We already have so many people who already are more qualified than you or as qualified as you who can't find jobs either. Good luck. Good luck with yourself.
Especially now when there's so many people that are unemployed that are overqualified for any position.
Oh, absolutely. Especially
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I mean, I think that that issue of work hard or pull yourself up by your bootstraps, it's true at an individual level, right? Of course, any individual can work harder and succeed, right? There's almost infinite amount of possibilities. You grind real hard, find a good opportunity, you can make more money, right? That's not something that I question, right? Any individual can make more money, right?
Right.
But when you look at it from a class perspective, right, under our current system, there is a big chunk of America that is deemed to make poverty wages, right?
Yep.
And those jobs are not going to provide for them, right? And different people can fill those jobs, but at the end of the day, there is a person working for wages that barely allow them to survive, right?
Barely allow them to survive in not even close to
Flourishing.
not only that, but not even close to conducive for a family.
Oh, absolutely.
Not even close to
Yeah.
conducive for a family.
That's why, you have those single mothers who are working 3 different jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
They wake up at 8 o'clock and come home at 12 p.m.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and they have their aunt, they have their mom, they have their et
grandmother.
cetera, grandmas taking care of the kids
Right.
and whatever else. It's like that is not
It's not how it
right.
should be. Yeah.
It's not how it should be.
Definitely. Yeah, well, I mean, we agree that America, there's something wrong here,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
the real question is how do we solve it, right? And
oil
is
prices
anything
are out of the roof.
right?
We're
But
on the brink of depression.
I feel like we're living through some real historical times here, right? We're hitting walls that we've never hit before,
It's
right?
very true.
And the American working class is really waking up to just how screwed up this whole system is, right? That's why I think Trump got elected in 2016 is because most of the people are fed up with the status quo. They're fed up with the system that we have in place, right? And I mean, that's why Bernie Sanders was able to do so well in a primary that was designed to ostracize people like him, right? He was able to, mobilize such a big part of America that believed in changing for the better, right? And I don't think we've seen the end of that process. I think that people are going to continue to fight for a better America. Now, where that direction goes, whether it goes towards socialism or it goes towards fascism, that's for us to determine, right? Whether we isolate ourselves and fight for our demographic and our demographic only, or if we want to, reach across demographic lines and fight for other people, fight for strangers, fight for people that we don't know. That's up to us to decide, right? And we're living in a real tumultuous time where we actually have the power to decide that, right? The powers that be are on shaky foundations, right? And right now is our opportunity to really look at what is unjust in America, how can we change it, and let's do that thing. Let's change it for the better.
Pretty good bow on top of that. Well, we've been going for 3 hours and 47 minutes.
It's been a long one.
This has been a long podcast. You guys want to wrap it up here?
Yeah, I think that's
Let's
Yeah,
wrap
sure.
this up. Well, we had quite a discussion, and I'm glad you guys could join us on the Outlet Podcast. Give us a like and a subscribe if you
Yeah.
did enjoy.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
It's fun.
thank you, Paul,
Maybe
for coming
another time
on.
in the future. It'd be fun.
Yeah, definitely. All right, thank you so much for listening.